The wheelchair rolled to a stop against the curb like it had made a decision. Marcus Webb sat there for a moment, both hands resting flat on the wheels, eyes fixed on the entrance to Carver's Coffee House the way a man studies a door he is not sure will open for him. The morning was cold, the kind of sharp November cold that comes off the river and finds every gap in your jacket, and the sidewalk was crowded with people who moved around him without looking at him, the way water moves around a stone it has long since stopped noticing. He had been doing this for 2 years. Coming here. Ordering the same black coffee. Sitting by the same window. Watching the same street fill up with the same strangers who never once asked his name. It was the closest thing to a routine he had left, and routines, his therapist had told him, were how you kept the days from blurring into something you could not account for. A woman in a charcoal blazer cut across the sidewalk without breaking stride, her roller bag clipping the back of Marcus's wheel hard enough to jolt him forward. She did not slow down. Did not look back. Just kept moving, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp and certain, already somewhere else in her head. Marcus watched her go. He had stopped expecting apologies a long time ago. He gripped the wheels and pushed himself toward the door. The entrance to Carver's had a ramp on the left side, a narrow concrete slope with a rusted metal rail that someone had installed about 15 years ago and nobody had thought to maintain since. The rail wobbled when Marcus grabbed it. The ramp had a crack running diagonally across the middle, and rain from 2 days ago had left a thin film of grime in the low spots. He navigated it carefully, the way he navigated everything now, with the patient mechanical attention of someone who had learned that one mistake in a wheelchair costs you more than one mistake on 2 feet ever did. Inside, the coffee house smelled like roasted beans and warm wood and something faintly sweet, cinnamon probably, coming from the pastry case near the register. The morning crowd was the usual mix. Students with laptops taking up 4-person tables. A group of women in workout clothes who had clearly just come from somewhere with mirrors. 2 men in hard hats waiting on to-go orders, boots leaving faint prints on the tile. Marcus found his usual spot by the window, the one table in the whole place that had enough room on one side for his chair, and positioned himself with his back to the wall the way he always did, the way you did when you had spent enough time in places where you needed to see what was coming. He ordered from the young woman with the red streak in her hair who always remembered his name and never made it weird. Black coffee, no sugar. She brought it over herself instead of calling it out, which he appreciated without ever saying so. The coffee was good. It was always good. That was the other reason he kept coming back. Marcus Webb had been a firefighter for 11 years before the building on Decatur Street changed everything. He had gone in on a residential call, a row house fire, 3rd floor, reports of a child trapped. Standard entry, standard conditions, nothing that should have gone differently than 100 other calls he had answered in a decade of doing the job he loved more than almost anything else in his life. The floor had given way on the 2nd level without warning. Structural compromise that the initial assessment had missed, a load-bearing section rotted through beneath the subfloor, invisible from above until it was not there anymore. Marcus had fallen 12 feet into the basement. His spine had absorbed the impact in the way spines are not designed to absorb impacts. By the time his crew got to him, he already knew from the silence in his legs that something permanent had happened. He spent 4 months in the hospital and another 8 in rehabilitation. He learned to use the chair with the same stubborn competence he had brought to everything else in his life, the same focused energy that had made him good at the job, that had made him someone his crew trusted when things went bad. He learned the distances between things, the angles of ramps and curbs and doorways, the precise geography of a world that had been designed mostly without him in mind. He learned which people looked at him and saw a person and which people looked at him and saw a problem. There were more of the second kind than he had expected. That was the thing nobody prepared you for. Not the chair itself, not the physical reality of it, not even the pain, which was constant and specific and had its own vocabulary now. The thing that caught you off guard was how other people changed. How some of them became suddenly careful around you in a way that felt like distance dressed up as kindness. How others became impatient in ways they did not bother to hide. How a certain type of person, usually young, usually comfortable, usually the kind who had never had anything taken from them without warning, would look at you and something in their face would shift into something you had no good word for. Not quite contempt. Not quite pity. Something that lived in the space between the two, something that said you have become less than what you were and I am glad I am not you. Marcus had seen that look in a lot of faces over 2 years. He had learned to read it the way you learn to read weather. He saw it come through the door of Carver's Coffee House at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning in the form of 2 young men who entered like they owned the place and everything adjacent to it. They were 22 at most, dressed in the specific casual way that is actually very expensive, the kind of clothes that are designed to look like you did not try while costing more than most people's rent. The taller one had the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told his presence was inconvenient. Sandy-haired, broad-shouldered, with the specific physical comfort of someone who played a sport at a level that got him attention. His friend was leaner, darker, wearing a jacket with a logo Marcus did not recognize but understood immediately, the kind of brand that exists purely to signal that you know what the brand means. They were loud without seeming to notice they were loud, their conversation filling the space around them the way sound fills a room when no one present has ever had to be quiet for anyone else's sake. Marcus watched them the way he watched most things now, steadily and without expression, from behind his coffee cup. They ordered at the counter, something complicated that took a while, and then they turned to find a place to sit. That was when the taller one saw Marcus. He did not look away. He nudged his friend and said something low, and his friend looked over too, and something passed between them. A shared recognition of something they found amusing, a private joke at the expense of the man by the window in the wheelchair. Marcus had seen this too. Many times. He kept his eyes on the street outside. He did not give them the reaction they were angling for. He had learned that much at least. He heard them settle at a table behind him, closer than they needed to be in a room with plenty of open seats, and he heard the shift in their voices, quieter now but not quiet, the kind of volume that is designed to be overheard by the person being discussed. "Poor guy," the taller one said, with the particular inflection that makes those 2 words into something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with sympathy. "Must be rough, you know, not being able to do anything." His friend laughed. "I mean at least he gets a good parking spot, right?" More laughter. Easy, satisfied, the laughter of people who feel safe. Marcus set his coffee cup down. He looked at the street. A woman was walking a dog outside, a big yellow lab that was straining at the leash toward a pigeon that had no interest in being caught. The dog's whole body was joy. Marcus watched it. He breathed. He had been in burning buildings. He had pulled people out of wreckage. He had lain on a basement floor with his legs gone quiet beneath him and waited for his crew to find him and kept his mind steady while he waited, talked himself through it the way they trained you to do, one breath and then the next, just the task in front of you, just this moment and nothing beyond it. He could handle 2 boys with too much money and not enough sense. He picked up his coffee again. That was when the third voice entered the situation. It came from the table to his left, where a woman had been sitting quietly for the last 20 minutes with a spiral notebook open in front of her and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She was maybe 35, wearing a dark green fleece over a collared shirt, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had better things to do with her morning than think about her hair. She had the look of someone who worked with her hands and her mind in equal measure, practical and precise, with the kind of stillness that is not passivity but readiness. Her name, Marcus would learn later, was Dr. Caroline Reyes, and she was a former Army combat medic who had spent 3 tours in places that had given her a very clear and unforgiving understanding of what courage actually cost and what cowardice actually looked like. She closed her notebook. She looked at the two young men behind Marcus with an expression that was completely calm and completely serious. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone accustomed to being heard in chaotic environments. "I am going to ask you to keep your conversation to yourselves." The taller one turned to look at her with the expression of someone who has never in his life been addressed that way by someone he did not consider his social equal. He took in the fleece and the notebook and the cold tea and made whatever calculation he made and smiled the particular smile of someone who has decided that the person speaking to him is not a real obstacle. "Is there a problem?" the taller one said. "Not yet," Caroline said. "There is not a problem yet. But there will be if you continue." His friend leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "She a friend of yours?" he asked Marcus. The question was designed to make Marcus small, to reduce him to a prop in someone else's scene, to remind everyone in earshot that he was the subject of this, the object, the thing being discussed, not a person capable of managing his own situation. Marcus looked at him. He looked at him steadily, the way you look at something you have assessed and categorized and are no longer particularly afraid of, and he said, very quietly, "I think you should listen to her. Not because of what comes next. Because of what you are right now." The taller one's smile flickered. His friend uncrossed his arms. There was a moment of recalibration, the kind that happens when people who are used to setting the terms of an interaction suddenly find the terms have been set for them. And then, because they were young and comfortable and had not yet encountered enough consequences for their choices, the taller one made the mistake that changed the entire morning. He stood up, scraping his chair back loudly on the tile floor, and he walked toward Marcus's table, and he put both hands flat on the surface of it, and he leaned in close, and he said, very clearly, in a voice meant to carry to every corner of the room, "Why don't you roll on out of here and let the adults talk?" The coffee house went quiet. The students with laptops looked up from their screens. The women from the gym stopped their conversation mid-sentence. The two men in hard hats turned from the counter. Everyone in the room heard it. Everyone in the room understood what it was. And in the 2 seconds of silence that followed, before anyone had decided what to do about it, Caroline Reyes stood up. The movement was unhurried and deliberate. She pushed her chair back with the care of someone who is not in a rush because she does not need to be. She picked up her notebook and her pen and she walked to Marcus's table, not to the two boys, to Marcus, and she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and looked at him like they were simply continuing a conversation that had been briefly interrupted. "I apologize for the interruption," she said to him, as if the two young men were not there at all. "I wanted to ask you about the project you mentioned." Marcus had never met this woman in his life. He had never mentioned any project. He understood immediately what she was doing, and something in his chest shifted, a small, precise movement, the feeling of a door opening that had been closed for a long time. He picked up his coffee. "Right," he said. "The roof assessment." She nodded. That was the one. The taller one had not moved from where he stood with his hands on the table. He was trying to process what had just happened, the way you process something when the script you expected to be following has been replaced without your permission. "What are you doing?" he said to Caroline. "Ignoring you," she said pleasantly. "You should try it sometime. It is very restful." His friend stood up from his chair. "She is talking to you, man," he said. "Yes," the taller one said. "Who are you, exactly?" Caroline looked at him then, directly and without performance, the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you are not performing. "I am someone who has watched people bleed out in the dirt," she said, in the same pleasant conversational tone. "I have held a man's hand while he died because a building fell on him during a mission that should have been safe. And I thought about all the things he did not get to do anymore, all the ordinary Tuesday mornings he was not going to have, and I promised him that I would not waste mine watching entitled boys play at being men." She let that sit for a moment. So if you would like to continue this conversation, she said, I am happy to have it. But I should tell you that I have been awake since 4 this morning and I have very little patience left for people who mistake cruelty for wit. The room was very quiet. The taller one's hands were still on the table. He was 18 or maybe 20 or maybe 22, and he had the particular kind of anger that comes from being embarrassed in public by someone you had already decided did not matter, the hot, scrambling anger of a person whose calculation has gone wrong in front of an audience. He looked around the room. The hard hats were watching. The students were watching. The women from the gym were watching. And every face said the same thing, the same quiet unified thing that faces say when a room has made up its mind about who it is rooting for. He straightened up. He looked at his friend. They exchanged the look of people deciding whether a situation is still worth the cost of continuing it. Marcus watched them do the math. He had done that math himself in burning buildings, the split-second calculus of when the risk had passed the point where the reward made sense. He recognized the moment when the calculation finished. The taller one stepped back from the table. He picked up his cup from where they had been sitting and walked toward the door with the stiff dignity of someone trying to look like they chose this. His friend followed. The door opened and closed. The noise of the street came in for a moment and then was gone. The coffee house held its collective breath for about 3 seconds, and then the students went back to their laptops and the women from the gym resumed their conversation and the men in hard hats got their orders called and picked them up and left, and the room returned to its ordinary Tuesday self. Caroline Reyes turned back to Marcus. She picked up her cold tea, looked at it, set it back down. I am going to get a fresh cup, she said. Can I get you anything? Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who got surprised easily. He had stopped expecting surprises somewhere around month 3 of his rehabilitation, when the world had made itself clear to him in ways he had not invited. But this was something different. This was a person who had sat in a coffee house alone on a Tuesday morning with a notebook and cold tea and had chosen, without hesitation, without calculation, without any apparent concern for the cost, to stand up. Just that. Just stand up. He thought about the woman with the roller bag who had not looked back. He thought about the months of not looking back that had collected like sediment in his chest. He thought about what it felt like to be a prop, an object, a subject being discussed rather than a person doing the discussing. He looked at Caroline Reyes and he said, another black coffee would be good, thank you. She nodded and went to the counter. Marcus turned back to the window. Outside, the yellow lab was still straining toward pigeons it would never catch. The morning was still cold. The street was still full of people going somewhere. But something in the room felt different now. Lighter by exactly the weight of what had just been said and done, and Marcus Webb sat with his coffee and the unfamiliar warmth of having been defended by a stranger and let himself, just for a moment, feel something he had not felt in a very long time. Not gratitude exactly. Something older than gratitude. Something that felt like being seen. Caroline came back with 2 cups. She set his down, settled into her chair, opened her notebook again. She did not ask him how he felt. She did not ask about the chair or the injury or what happened. She did not do any of the things people usually did, the hovering, the softening, the careful tiptoeing around the fact of him. She simply opened her notebook and said, so. What is it you actually do? And Marcus Webb, who had not talked about himself to a stranger in 14 months, found that he had an answer. He told her he was a structural assessor now. He said it plainly, without apology, the way you say a thing that cost you something to arrive at. After the injury, after the rehabilitation, after the months of figuring out who he was when he was no longer the person he had been, he had gone back to school at 34 and studied structural engineering. It made sense to him in a way that was hard to explain to people who had not lived it. He had spent 11 years understanding how buildings failed, how they gave way without warning, how the thing that looked solid from the outside was sometimes hollow at the center in ways that only became visible at the worst possible moment. He understood failure from the inside now, structurally and personally, and that understanding turned out to be useful. He worked for a firm that contracted with the city, inspecting older buildings for exactly the kinds of hidden compromises that had taken him off the job in the first place. He went into structures that other people assessed from the outside and found the places where things were not what they appeared to be. It was slow work and detailed work and sometimes lonely work, but it was honest, and it was his, and on the days when his spine reminded him of what it had absorbed, when the pain climbed from a background hum to something that demanded his full attention, he held onto the fact of the work the way you hold onto something that keeps you oriented when everything else is moving. Caroline listened without interrupting. She had the quality of someone who had been trained to take in information accurately, to hear what was actually being said rather than what she was expecting to hear, to resist the impulse to fill silence with her own noise. When he finished, she nodded once, the nod of someone who is filing something away. "That makes sense," she said. "More sense than most things people do with what happened to them." He asked her what she meant. She thought about it for a moment in the deliberate way of someone who takes words seriously enough to choose them carefully. "I mean that most people who get broken by something spend a long time trying to go back to exactly what they were before," she said. "Trying to rebuild the original thing. And sometimes you can and sometimes you cannot, and either way you spend years fighting the wrong battle. What you did was different. You used what the thing taught you. You let the knowledge cost you something and then you put it to work." Marcus looked at his coffee. He had thought about it that way before, in quiet moments, in the kind of clarity that comes late at night when the pain is manageable and the day is done and you have nothing to do but sit with the truth of your own life. But he had not heard anyone else say it out loud, had not heard it reflected back in plain language by someone who seemed to understand what they were saying. He asked her how she ended up in a coffee house on a Tuesday morning with a cold cup of tea and a notebook. She smiled, small and real, the kind of smile that does not perform anything. She told him she had left the army 5 years ago after her third tour. She worked now as a trauma response consultant. She helped hospitals and emergency services develop protocols for situations that did not fit neatly into existing frameworks. She traveled a lot, she said, which was fine because she did not have a lot holding her to any one place. Not because her life was empty but because she had learned to be comfortable with motion, with the state of being between things, with the particular freedom and particular loneliness of a life built on purpose rather than proximity. She was in the city for a 2-day consultation with the regional hospital system. She had come to Carver's because it was close to her hotel and because the reviews said the coffee was good and because she had learned to value small reliable pleasures in the same way she valued good equipment, not glamorous, not exciting, but dependable, and dependable mattered. Marcus said that was a good reason to be anywhere. She agreed that it was. They sat with their coffees in the way of two people who have just discovered an unexpected ease with each other, a mutual recognition, the particular comfort of finding someone who speaks a language you had almost stopped expecting to hear. Outside, the morning moved forward. The street filled and emptied and filled again. The coffee house cycled through its morning crowd, people coming and going, conversations beginning and ending, the ordinary traffic of a city going about its Tuesday. And at the table by the window, a man in a wheelchair and a woman with a notebook talked about buildings and battlefields and the long difficult work of becoming something new out of something broken, and neither of them looked at the door through which two young men had walked out, because there was nothing in that direction worth looking at anymore. What Marcus did not know yet, sitting there with his second black coffee going warm between his hands, was that the two young men who had walked out of Carver's coffee house were not finished. He did not know that the taller one, whose name was Bryce Calloway, had a father who was a city council member with influence over contracts that included the firm Marcus worked for. He did not know that Bryce Calloway was the kind of young man who had grown up understanding that humiliation was not something you absorbed, it was something you redirected, that the right response to being made small in front of an audience was to find a larger stage and reverse the outcome. He did not know that Bryce had already taken out his phone in the parking lot and was calling his father, his voice tight with the specific aggrieved energy of someone who has decided that the world owes him a correction. He did not know any of that yet. He just knew that his coffee was good and the woman across from him was interesting, and that for the first time in longer than he could precisely recall, a Tuesday morning felt like something worth being present for. That feeling, uncomplicated and quiet and real, would last exactly 4 more days before everything changed. Before the phone calls started. Before the letter arrived at his firm. Before he understood that standing up, even when you are sitting down, even when someone else does the standing on your behalf, always costs something, and the only question is whether what it costs is worth what it buys. But on this particular Tuesday morning, in this particular coffee house that smelled like cinnamon and roasted beans and the good ordinary warmth of a room full of people living their lives, Marcus Webb did not know any of that yet. He just sat with his coffee and the unexpected company of a stranger who had chosen, without hesitation, to be decent. And for now, that was enough. And for now, that was enough. The letter arrived on a Friday. It came in a standard business envelope, ivory-colored, the firm's name printed in the upper left corner in the kind of font that is meant to convey authority without effort, and Marcus's name typed in the center with the precision of a document that had been reviewed before being sent. He found it in his mail slot at the office, between a contractor invoice and a memo about the holiday schedule, and he recognized before he even opened it that it was the kind of letter that changes the shape of your day. He opened it at his desk, in the quiet of his corner office on the second floor, the one with the window that looked out over the loading dock and that nobody else had wanted precisely because of that view, which was why Marcus had taken it without hesitation, because he liked watching things being moved from one place to another, liked the visible honest logic of it, and also because the light in the afternoon came in at an angle that was useful when he was reviewing drawings. He read the letter twice. Then he set it flat on the desk and looked at it the way he looked at structural assessments that contained information he did not want to be true but could not argue with. The letter was from the firm's senior partner, a man named Gerald Okafor, who had hired Marcus 2 years ago with the specific and plainly stated belief that Marcus's particular combination of field experience and academic training made him valuable in ways that other assessors were not. Gerald Okafor was a careful man and a fair man, and the letter he had written was both careful and fair, which somehow made it worse. It said that the firm had received a communication from a member of the City Council's Oversight Committee raising concerns about a conflict of interest in Marcus's most recent assessment of the Alderman Street building complex. It said that pending review, Marcus was being placed on administrative leave with full pay. It said that this was a standard procedural step and did not constitute a finding or a judgment. It said that Gerald hoped Marcus understood the position the firm was in and that he looked forward to resolving the matter quickly. It said all of these things in precise, careful language that meant, when you translated it from the dialect of institutional caution into plain English, that someone with power had made a phone call, and the firm had decided that the cost of not listening was higher than the cost of what they were doing to Marcus. He sat with the letter for a long time. Outside the window, 2 men in coveralls were moving a pallet of tile across the loading dock with a forklift, and the forklift was making the particular backing up beep that forklifts make, steady and regular and indifferent to everything around it. Marcus listened to it and thought about Bryce Calloway, whose name he had not known 4 days ago, whose face he had already half forgotten, who had walked out of a coffee house looking diminished and had apparently decided that the correct response to feeling diminished was to use his father's office phone. He thought about the way power worked when it was applied not through confrontation but through infrastructure, through quiet calls and letters in ivory envelopes and the language of procedural review, through all the mechanisms that exist specifically to give the powerful a way to act on the powerless without ever having to look them in the face while doing it. He folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. He finished the drawing he had been working on. He locked his office and wheeled himself to the elevator and went down to the lobby and out through the accessible entrance on the east side of the building, the one with the ramp that actually met code, and he sat in the thin November sunlight for a moment before he called Caroline Reyes. He had her number because she had given it to him on Tuesday when they left the coffee house, not with any particular implication, just the straightforward exchange of people who have recognized something useful in each other and are practical enough to preserve it. He had put it in his phone without expecting to use it quickly. He called her now because she was the only person he could think of who would understand what the letter meant without needing it explained, who would hear the shape of it and recognize it from the inside. She answered on the second ring. He told her about the letter. He read her the relevant section. There was a silence on her end that was not the silence of someone who was surprised but the silence of someone who is thinking carefully. Then she said, "How long have you worked there?" 2 years, Marcus said. Any performance issues, any complaints, any record of anything that could support the conflict of interest claim? Nothing, Marcus said. The Alderman Street assessment was standard. I flagged 3 issues, all documented, all with photographic support. There is nothing in my work they can actually point to. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "This is not about your work." He said he knew that. She asked him if he had a union or a professional association. He said he had both. She said to call them today, before the weekend, before the firm had time to build more of a record. She said to document everything, every communication, every date, the letter, the timeline from Tuesday to Friday, all of it, in writing, sent to himself by email so there was a timestamp. She said to be very careful not to do anything that could be framed as uncooperative or volatile, because that was what they would be looking for, any evidence that he was the kind of person who created problems, any thread they could pull to turn this into a story about him rather than a story about them. She said all of this in the measured, efficient voice of someone who had navigated institutional cruelty before and had learned exactly which moves mattered and in which order they needed to be made. Marcus listened and took the advice and said thank you. She said don't thank me yet. He asked her where she was. She said she was still in the city, her consultation had been extended by a day, she was at the hotel 2 blocks from Carver's. He asked if she wanted to get coffee. There was a brief pause, the small recalibration of a person shifting from one mode to another. Then she said yes, but not at Carver's, somewhere with better parking and fewer memories. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed since Tuesday and the sound of it surprised him slightly, like a noise you had forgotten your own body could make. They met at a place called Thornwood on the south end of the downtown district, a quieter coffee shop with high ceilings and wide tables and an entrance that was genuinely accessible rather than technically compliant, which Marcus noted and appreciated in the specific way of someone who catalogs these things automatically. The way you catalog the structural integrity of a building you walk into, not out of anxiety but out of professional habit, out of the knowledge that details matter and that the details that are easy to overlook are often the ones that matter most. Caroline was already there when he arrived, sitting at a table near the back with 2 cups in front of her and her notebook open again, because, she would tell him later, the notebook was less a tool and more a habit, the physical act of writing things down being the way she slowed her own thinking enough to actually look at it. She pushed one of the cups toward him as he settled at the table. He looked at it. Black coffee. She said she had guessed. He said she had guessed right. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the letter specifically, not about Bryce Calloway or his father or the machinery that had been set in motion, but around all of it, circling the thing the way you circle a structural problem when you want to understand it fully before you start making decisions about how to address it. Caroline told him about a case she had worked on 3 years ago, a hospital system in the Southwest that had quietly transferred a nurse out of her unit after she filed a complaint about a senior physician. The transfer had been handled through the language of professional development, of growth opportunities, of the natural rotation of staff, all the vocabulary of institutional benevolence applied to what was in fact institutional retaliation. The nurse had been told by 3 different people in 3 different ways that fighting it would cost more than accepting it, that the physician was too connected, that the system was too large, that the sensible thing was to move forward and not make it a thing. She had not listened. She had documented everything and filed a formal complaint with the state medical board and contacted a journalist who covered healthcare accountability, and she had won, not quickly, not cleanly, not without cost, but she had won, and the physician had lost his privileges, and the hospital had changed its reporting protocols, and 3 other nurses who had been waiting to see what happened had come forward with their own complaints. Marcus asked what happened to the nurse afterward. Caroline said she left the hospital by her own choice, took a position at a smaller facility in a different city, and told Caroline 2 years later that she did not regret any of it, not the fight and not the leaving, because she had learned something important about the difference between the life you are living and the life you are capable of living, and you cannot unlearn that once you know it. Marcus sat with that for a moment. He thought about the building on Decatur Street, about the 12-foot fall, about the 4 months in the hospital and the 8 months in rehabilitation and the 2 years of learning to be a different version of himself in a world that had not especially adjusted to accommodate him. He thought about the letter in his jacket pocket and the ivory envelope and the careful language of institutional caution and the forklift making its steady backing up beep outside his window. He thought about Bryce Calloway in the parking lot, phone already in hand, aggrieved and calculating, translating his own embarrassment into leverage. He thought about what it cost to fight something like that and what it cost not to, and he understood. In the particular clear way that you understand things when you are sitting in a quiet room with good coffee and a person who is telling you the truth, that the math only looked like a choice from a certain angle. From every other angle it was already decided. You either absorbed the thing or you pushed back against it, and absorbing it did not actually make it stop. It just made it invisible, which was a different problem but not a smaller one. He asked Caroline if she had any contacts at the city level, anyone who worked in oversight or accountability, anyone who would understand what a city council member using his office to pressure a private firm on behalf of his son actually looked like in the language of ethics violations. She looked at him over her coffee cup with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a question and is pleased it has finally arrived. She said she might know 1 or 2 people. She said she would make some calls over the weekend. She said that the most important thing he could do right now was to continue being exactly who he was, to do his work with the same care and precision he had always brought to it, to give nobody anything to point at, to be the person that his record already showed him to be, patient and thorough and honest, because that record was the foundation everything else would be built on, and foundations, Marcus knew better than most, were what determined whether something stood or fell when pressure was applied. He said he understood that. She said she knew he did. They finished their coffees. Outside, the afternoon had moved into the particular gray softness of a November evening in a northern city, the light going flat and even, the street lamps coming on early, people pulling their jackets tighter as they walked. Marcus and Caroline sat in the warm interior of Thornwood and talked about other things, about his assessment work and her consulting and the specific textures of lives lived in service of something larger than comfort, and the conversation had the quality of something that was not going to be a single afternoon, that was already extending itself forward into time in ways neither of them had quite planned but both of them recognized. When they left, Marcus wheeled himself to his van in the parking structure and Caroline walked to her hotel, and before they separated she turned and said one more thing. She said, "I want you to know that what I did on Tuesday was not charity." He looked at her. She said, "I sat in that room and I watched what was happening and I made a choice based on what I thought was right, the same way I made choices in the field, the same way I make choices now. I did not do it for you. I did not even know you. I did it because silence in the face of that kind of thing is a choice too, and I had already made mine a long time ago." He held her gaze. He said he understood the difference. She nodded once. Then she walked toward her hotel and Marcus drove home through streets that were familiar and streets that were not, through the city he had lived in for most of his adult life, the city where he had run into burning buildings and fallen through floors and learned to navigate the world from a different height, and he thought about foundations and about pressure and about what it meant to be the kind of person who did not look away. He thought about Bryce Calloway's father sitting in his council office, comfortable and certain. Confident that the machinery he had set in motion would produce the result he intended. He thought about the letter in his pocket and the phone calls Caroline was going to make over the weekend and the documentation he was going to begin tonight, organized and time-stamped and precise, the way all good structural work was organized and time-stamped and precise. He thought about the nurse in the Southwest who had won. He turned onto his street. He pulled into his driveway. He sat in the van for a moment in the quiet of the engine cooling, in the dark of a Friday evening with the weekend ahead and a fight that had not yet fully declared itself but that he could already see the shape of, the way you see the shape of a structural problem in a building before you have put language to it, before you have written it into a report, the moment of recognition that comes before everything else and that you learn, over time, to trust. He did not know yet how long it would take. He did not know the names of the people who would stand beside him or the names of the people who would decide that standing beside him cost too much. He did not know which parts of his life would bend under the pressure and which parts would hold. But he knew the foundation. He knew what he had done and why he had done it, and he knew that the record of his work was clean and thorough and honest, and that a man who had walked into burning buildings for 11 years was not going to be moved by an ivory envelope and the careful language of institutional caution. He got out of the van. He locked it. He went inside. And he sat down at his kitchen table and opened his laptop and began to write. He wrote everything he could remember about Tuesday morning in chronological order. The time he arrived at Carver's, 7:52, which he knew because he had checked his phone while he was waiting for the ramp door to hold open long enough for him to get through it. The time the two young men arrived, 8:47, which he knew because he had looked at the clock on the wall behind the counter when the noise level in the room changed in the specific way that rooms change when certain kinds of people enter them, the way the air shifts, the way the existing conversation adjusts itself around a new and louder presence. He wrote what they had said, as accurately as he could recall it, in quotation marks, with notes where he was uncertain about the precise wording. He wrote what Caroline had said and what he had said and what the taller one had said when he stood up and put his hands on the table, and he wrote it all the way through to the moment the door closed behind them and the room returned to itself. He wrote the date and the time of each thing, and he sent the document to his own email address with the subject line Tuesday November incident record, and then he started a second document and wrote down everything about the letter, quoting the relevant sections verbatim, and noted the date he received it and the date it had been written, which were 2 days apart, and noted that the Friday delivery meant he had the weekend before he could reach anyone at the firm, which may or may not have been a coincidence but was worth noting either way. He sent that document to himself too. Then he called his professional association's after-hours line and left a message explaining the situation in plain factual language, asking for a call back first thing Monday morning. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed for a while. His apartment was on the third floor of a building that had been retrofitted for accessibility in the 90s, imperfectly but genuinely, with wide doorways and a reliable elevator and a bathroom that had been reconfigured with the specific and particular needs of wheelchair users actually in mind, which was rarer than it should have been and which Marcus had learned to value accordingly. He had lived here for 3 years. The walls had things on them that mattered to him. A photograph of his crew taken at a station cookout 2 summers before the accident, everyone grinning in the particular way of people who are doing work they love and are happy in the specific moment of the photograph. A frame drawing his niece had made when she was 7, a fire truck with proportions that were entirely wrong and colors that were entirely right. A street map of the city with small red dots marking every building he had assessed in 2 years of doing this work, the dots accumulating slowly across the grid, the visible record of all the hidden things he had found and named and written into reports that would keep other people safe from the kinds of failures that were easy to miss if you were not looking in exactly the right places. He looked at the map for a long time. He thought about the Alderman Street assessment specifically, the one named in the letter as the source of the alleged conflict of interest. He had been thorough on that one, as he was thorough on all of them. The building was a mixed-use residential and commercial structure built in the late 1960s. Acquired 3 years ago by a development company that had applied for city permits to convert the upper floors to luxury condominiums. Marcus had found 3 issues. A section of load-bearing wall on the 4th floor that had been partially removed during an earlier unauthorized renovation, leaving the structure above it without adequate support. Moisture intrusion in the basement that had compromised the foundation slab in 2 locations. And electrical conduit running through a wall cavity that had not been properly insulated, creating a fire hazard that was invisible from the surface and would have been missed by a less attentive inspection. He had written all of this up in precise technical language with photographs and measurements and citations from the relevant building code sections. His report had recommended that the permits be held pending remediation of all 3 issues. He had submitted the report through the firm's standard process. He had not spoken to anyone outside the firm about it. He had not received any communication from the development company or from anyone associated with it. There was no conflict of interest. There was not even the appearance of one unless you were willing to define conflict of interest as the act of doing your job accurately in a way that created an inconvenient outcome for someone with political connections. He understood now, looking at the map on his wall with all its red dots, that what had actually happened was straightforward even if it was not simple. The development company that owned the Alderman Street building was connected to someone connected to Councilman Calloway. Marcus's report had delayed their permit. The delay cost them money and time. Someone had called someone. Bryce Calloway's tantrum in a coffee house had provided an occasion, a pretext, a way to frame a complaint that might otherwise have been too nakedly self-interested to survive any scrutiny. That was what the ivory envelope was actually about. Not the coffee house. Not Marcus's disability. Not the 2 young men who had walked in that morning with their aggressive loud ease and their certainty that the world would arrange itself around their comfort. Those were the trigger, not the cause. The cause was older and simpler and more familiar. Somebody wanted something Marcus's work was standing in the way of, and they had found a lever, and they had used it. He knew this kind of problem. He had studied it in buildings for 2 years. The visible damage always pointed back to something structural, something underneath, something that had been there quietly compromising the integrity of the whole long before the surface gave way. You fixed buildings by finding the actual source. You fixed everything else the same way. He turned off the light over the kitchen table and sat in the dark for a moment, not out of despair but out of the kind of quiet that is useful before a long piece of work, the stillness you give yourself before you begin something that is going to require everything you have. Then he turned the light back on. He made tea, the kind his mother had made, strong and plain, in the same stainless steel pot he had used since he was 23. He brought it to the table and opened his laptop again and started researching Councilman Calloway, starting with the public record, the council votes, the campaign donors, the committee assignments, the public statements. The paper trail that every elected official leaves behind whether they intend to or not, because public power exercised in public produces a public record, and public records, Marcus had learned, were a kind of structural document, a map of the forces acting on a system, readable by anyone patient enough to look carefully and honest enough to write down what they found. He worked until past midnight. When he finally closed the laptop, the tea was cold and the city outside his window had gone quiet in the particular deep quiet of a Friday night moving toward Saturday morning, and Marcus Webb sat in his kitchen with the documented beginning of a fight he had not chosen but was not going to lose, and felt, beneath the tiredness and the anger and the careful steady discipline of a man who had learned to keep his head when things went wrong, the specific unambiguous clarity of someone who knows exactly where they stand, the specific unambiguous clarity of someone who knows exactly where they stand. The weekend passed the way weekends pass when you are waiting for something to start. Marcus kept his routine. Saturday morning he went to the gym 2 blocks from his apartment, the one with the adaptive equipment and the trainer named Deshaun, who had never once looked at Marcus like he was anything other than a regular client with specific technical requirements. He worked through his upper body circuit with the focused economy of someone who understood that physical strength was not vanity but infrastructure, the maintenance of the thing that carried everything else. He sweated and breathed and did not think about ivory envelopes. On Saturday afternoon he drove out to the east side of the city to visit his mother, who lived in the same house he had grown up in, a narrow 2-story with a front porch that listed slightly to the left and a garden that his mother tended with the same exacting patience she had applied to everything in her life. She was 71 and still sharp in the particular way of women who have spent decades paying close attention to things other people overlooked. She made him lunch and asked about work, and he told her about the administrative leave in the plain neutral language of a man reporting a fact rather than asking for comfort. She listened with her hands folded on the table, the way she had always listened to difficult news, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "What are you going to do about it?" He said he was going to document everything and contact his union and talk to someone who understood the ethics process at the city level. She nodded. She said, "And the woman from the coffee house?" He looked at her. She said, "You mentioned her." She said it the way she said most things, without particular inflection, the word landing in the space between them and sitting there. Marcus said Caroline was making some calls on his behalf over the weekend. His mother nodded again and picked up her fork and said that was good, that it was important to know which people were the kind who made phone calls and which people were the kind who said they would and then got busy. He drove home in the late afternoon with the low November sun coming through the windshield at an angle that required the visor and the specific careful attention of someone driving a modified vehicle through familiar streets, and he thought about his mother's question about Caroline, and he thought about the way it had been asked, and he thought about the fact that his mother, who had been paying close attention to things other people overlooked for 71 years, had noticed something in the way he talked about a woman he had known for 4 days. He thought about that for exactly one exit on the highway and then he moved on because there was too much else to think about and because some things benefited from being left alone long enough to become clear on their own. Caroline called Sunday afternoon. She had spoken to 2 people over the weekend. The first was a woman named Adrienne Foster who worked as an ethics investigator in the city's Office of Inspector General, someone Caroline had met 3 years ago at a conference on institutional accountability and had stayed in touch with in the loose but genuine way of people who respect each other's work without being close. Adrienne had listened to the outline of the situation and said, carefully, that she could not comment on any specific matter but that if someone were to file a formal complaint with supporting documentation, that complaint would be reviewed on its merits through the standard process, and that the standard process, whatever some people chose to believe about it, was designed to be independent of the political relationships of the people named in complaints. She said this twice, with slight emphasis the second time, in a way that Caroline understood to mean that independence was real but not guaranteed, that the process was only as strong as the people willing to use it, and that documentation was the thing that made the difference between a complaint that went somewhere and a complaint that got filed and forgotten. The second person Caroline had spoken to was a journalist named Paul Whitmore who covered city government for the regional paper, specifically the intersection of development money and political influence, which was a beat he had been on for 7 years and which had produced 3 significant investigations, 2 of which had led to actual consequences for the people named in them. Paul had also listened carefully and had also been careful in what he said, but he had asked 3 specific questions about the Alderman Street development, about the permit timeline, and about the connection between the development company and Councilman Calloway's campaign donations, questions that told Caroline he already knew something about the subject and was interested in knowing more. She told Marcus all of this in the organized sequential way of someone delivering a briefing, and when she finished there was a pause and Marcus said, "You did all that this weekend?" She said she had made some calls, it was not a complicated thing to do. He said it was not nothing either. She was quiet for a moment. She said she wanted to be honest with him about something. He said go ahead. She said that what she had set in motion was real and could be useful, but that it was also only the beginning, and that the beginning was the easy part, and that the middle was where most people found out the actual price of doing this kind of thing and decided the price was too high. She said she had seen that happen before, people who were absolutely clear and certain at the start and who found, somewhere in the middle, that the cost had exceeded what they had budgeted for it, in time or energy or professional consequence or simple human exhaustion, and who made the decision that a partial fight was better than a finished one. She was not saying he would do that. She was saying she wanted him to know, before they went further, that she was going to see it through from her side regardless, that she did not start things she was not prepared to finish, but that it was his situation and his career and his life, and he had the right to decide at any point that the fight was not worth continuing, and she would not think less of him for that because she understood what these things actually cost in ways that most people did not. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I spent 11 years running into buildings that were on fire. She said she knew that. He said, I know what things cost. She said she knew that too. He said, make the introduction to Adrian Foster. She said she would send the contact information that evening. She said one more thing before they got off the phone. She said, I looked up the Alderman Street building. He waited. She said, the development company that owns it is called Meridian Urban Partners. He said yes. She said, Meridian Urban Partners is a subsidiary of a holding company called Cornerstone Development Group. He said he had found the same thing. She said, Cornerstone Development Group made a $47,000 contribution to Councilman Calloway's re-election campaign 14 months ago. He said he had found that too. She said, this is not complicated. He said, no. It is not complicated. It is just covered up. She said, not for much longer. The week that followed was the kind of week that does not feel like much while you are living through it, but that you understand later was the week when everything was actually decided, the week when the structure of what was going to happen was assembled even though the visible event was still weeks away. Marcus met with his union representative on Monday morning, a man named Thomas Greer who had been doing this work for 22 years and who had seen variations of this situation enough times that he could identify the pattern within 10 minutes of hearing the details. Thomas Greer had a small office in a building that smelled like old carpet and printer toner and the particular accumulated history of a lot of fights, some won and some lost, and he listened to Marcus with his hands folded on his desk in a way that reminded Marcus of his mother and said, when Marcus finished, this is a straightforward case of retaliatory administrative action and we have seen this specific mechanism 3 times in the last 5 years in the city alone. He said the good news was that the documentation Marcus had started over the weekend was exactly right, both in content and in approach, and that he should continue adding to it every day, everything said and written and communicated, all of it time-stamped and organized. He said the less good news was that straightforward did not mean fast. He said the process had its own timeline and the timeline was not designed for the convenience of the person who had been wronged. He said Marcus should expect this to take months rather than weeks and should prepare himself accordingly, practically and emotionally, because the middle of these things had a particular quality of grinding patience testing tedium that was harder in its own way than the dramatic moments, the letters, and the hearings, were harder than the slow accumulation of waiting days when nothing visible happened but the pressure was constant. Marcus said he had spent 8 months in rehabilitation learning to use a wheelchair from scratch. He said he was familiar with the concept of patience testing tedium. Thomas Greer looked at him and for the first time since Marcus had walked in he smiled, the small genuine smile of someone recognizing a quality they respect. He said, "Good. Then let us get started." Marcus filed the formal complaint with the Office of Inspector General on Wednesday. He submitted it through the online portal with all his documentation attached, the incident record from Tuesday morning, the letter from the firm, his complete Alderman Street assessment with all supporting materials, the public record of Cornerstone Development Group's campaign contribution to Calloway, the timeline linking Tuesday to Friday, and a clear precise narrative statement explaining the sequence of events and their relationship to each other. He submitted it and received an automated confirmation with a case number and a notice that initial review would take up to 30 business days. He wrote the case number on a piece of paper and taped it to the inside of his kitchen cabinet door next to the fire extinguisher, where he would see it every morning. He also, on Thursday, sent Caroline a message saying the complaint had been filed. She replied within minutes with 3 words. "Good. Keep going." He did. He went to work each day of that week, because administrative leave with full pay meant he was still an employee of the firm and still had access to the office, and because staying away felt like the wrong message to send, like accepting a definition of himself that he had not agreed to. He sat at his desk and worked on the drawings and reports that were not connected to the Alderman Street matter. He was professional and precise and spoke to his colleagues with the same direct courtesy he always had. He said nothing about the complaint to anyone at the firm except Gerald Okafor, whom he informed by email, brief and factual, that he had filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General's office as was his right under the terms of his employment contract, and that he looked forward to a prompt resolution of the administrative review. Gerald Okafor did not reply to that email for 4 days. When he did, his reply was 2 sentences. He acknowledged receipt of Marcus's message. He said the firm would cooperate with any formal review process. It was, Marcus thought, the reply of a man who was watching something he had set in motion and was beginning to have complicated feelings about where it was going. On Friday, exactly 1 week after the ivory envelope had arrived in his mail slot, Marcus wheeled himself out of the office at the end of the day and sat for a moment in the thin afternoon light, which was weaker now than it had been the week before, the year contracting toward its shortest days, the sky going pale and close. He thought about the week. He thought about Thomas Greer and his folded hands and his 22 years of this kind of work. He thought about Adrienne Foster and her careful language and the things she had managed to communicate in the spaces between what she said. He thought about Paul Whitmore asking 3 specific questions about Meridian Urban Partners and permit timelines. He thought about the complaint with its case number taped inside his cabinet door. He thought about the map on his wall with its accumulation of red dots, each one a building assessed, each one a hidden problem named and documented and handed to the people responsible for fixing it. He thought about his crew in the photograph on his wall, all those grinning faces, and about the building on Decatur Street, and about the 12-foot fall, and about what it had taken to become who he was now, sitting in a parking lot on a Friday afternoon with a fight in progress and a foundation that held. He called Caroline. She answered on the 3rd ring. He said, "I filed on Wednesday, the union is engaged, the OIG has the complaint." She said, "How do you feel?" He thought about it honestly, the way she had seemed to always do, taking the question seriously enough to give it a real answer. He said, "Like I am standing on something solid." She said, "That is the right feeling." He said, "How are you?" She said she was on a plane to Denver in the morning for another consultation but that she would be back in the city in 10 days and that she wanted to hear how things were developing. He said he would keep her updated. She said she knew he would. There was a pause, the comfortable kind, the kind between 2 people who have moved past the stage of needing to fill silence with words. Then she said, "You did the right things this week." He said, "I had a good example." She said nothing to that but he heard something in the quiet that he would think about later, on the drive home, in the way you think about things that are still becoming clear, that have not yet resolved into the specific shape they are going to take but that you can already feel the outline of, solid and real beneath your hands like the load-bearing wall of a building that was always going to stand, that was always going to hold, regardless of what the surface had been told to look like. The 10 days Caroline was in Denver were the kind of 10 days that test the patience in ways you do not fully anticipate. Marcus had built his structure carefully. The complaint was filed. The union was engaged. The documentation was thorough. Everything that could be done in the first week had been done, and now the process had its own momentum, grinding forward at the speed of institutions, which is to say slowly and without any particular regard for the urgency felt by the individual at the center of it. He came to work every day. He did his work. He spoke to no one about the complaint except Thomas Greer, with whom he had a standing check-in call every Monday at 9, and he answered the questions put to him and offered nothing extra because Thomas had told him that in matters like this, silence was often the most powerful available tool, not the silence of someone with something to hide but the silence of someone who has said what needed to be said in the correct format through the correct channels and is under no obligation to repeat himself in other venues for the benefit of people who would use the information in ways he could not control. His colleagues were careful around him. He noticed this without making anything of it. Some of them were careful in the way of people who are sympathetic but afraid to show it, who pass your desk and make eye contact a half-second longer than usual and then move on, communicating support through the minimum viable signal. Others were careful in the way of people who have decided that the politically prudent position is to wait and see, who are not against you but are not willing to be for you until the outcome is clear enough to make choosing a side feel safe. Marcus had spent enough time in burning buildings to understand the difference between someone who ran toward the fire and someone who waited at the perimeter, and he did not resent the perimeter waiters. Most people lived at the perimeter. That was not a moral failing. It was just how most people were built. What mattered was that the people running toward the fire knew what they were doing and kept moving. On the 7th day of waiting, a Wednesday, Marcus received an email from Paul Whitmore. It was brief and professional, identifying himself by name and publication and explaining that he was working on a piece about the relationship between development interests and city council oversight decisions and that he had come across Marcus's name in connection with the Alderman Street permit review and wondered if Marcus would be willing to speak with him on or off the record at his convenience. Marcus forwarded the email to Thomas Greer before responding. Thomas called back within an hour and said that speaking to a journalist was Marcus's own decision to make but that if he chose to do so, he should say nothing that was not already in the public record or in the formal complaint, that he should not speculate and should not editorialize and should not allow himself to be drawn into characterizing the motives of anyone named in the complaint, because characterizing motives was the thing that got people in trouble in these situations, that turned a factual account into something that could be spun back against you. He said journalists served a function and sometimes that function was genuinely useful in cases like this but that they also had their own interests and their own timelines and their own editors and that the relationship between a source and a journalist was always partly cooperative and partly something else that needed to be navigated carefully. Marcus thought about it for the rest of the day. He thought about the nurse in the Southwest that Caroline had told him about, and the journalist who had covered her case, and the way that coverage had shifted the balance of what was possible. He thought about the Alderman Street building and the 3 issues in his report and the load-bearing wall on the 4th floor that someone had partially removed during an unauthorized renovation and then plastered over so that nothing visible at the surface suggested the absence of what should have been there. He thought about all the things that stayed hidden because nobody with a platform chose to shine a light on them. He wrote back to Paul Whitmore that evening. He said he was willing to speak and that he preferred to do so in person. He suggested the following Monday. Paul Whitmore replied within 20 minutes with a time and a location and a brief sentence saying he appreciated Marcus making the time. Marcus forwarded the exchange to Thomas Greer. Thomas replied with 2 words. Be careful. Marcus wrote back, I know how to read a structure. Thomas did not respond to that but Marcus imagined him in his office with its old carpet smell reading those 6 words and understanding them. Caroline came back from Denver on a Thursday evening. She texted him from the airport, just the word back followed by a question mark, which Marcus understood to mean she was asking how things stood. He replied with a summary in 4 sentences. Complaint filed and processing. Union engaged and active. Journalist contact made, meeting Monday. Firm still quiet. She replied, good. Call me when you can. He called her that night after dinner, sitting at his kitchen table with the map on the wall visible from where he sat and the red dots accumulating in his line of sight like a record he had been keeping without fully knowing its purpose. They talked for 40 minutes. She told him about Denver, about the hospital system there and the specific institutional failure she had been brought in to address, a breakdown in crisis communication protocols that had led to 3 avoidable errors in 12 months, each one small enough to explain away individually but forming a clear and serious pattern when you looked at them together, which was the thing that institutional cultures were generally very good at preventing anyone from doing, looking at things together. Because looking at things together was how you found the patterns that powerful people needed to remain invisible. He told her about Paul Whitmore's email and his decision to meet with him. She said she thought that was the right call, handled carefully. He said Thomas had the same view. She said Thomas Greer was a good man who had been doing this long enough to have earned his caution and that listening to him carefully while also trusting his own judgment was the right balance to try to maintain. He said, "That is a careful way to say what you mean." She laughed, brief and real. She said, "I am a careful person." He said, "I know." There was a pause and then she said, "How are you actually doing?" "Not the process, you." He thought about it. He said, "I am managing." She said that was not the same as fine. He said he knew it was not the same as fine. He said that there were days when the weight of it sat on him in a way that was hard to move around, days when the gap between what the situation was and what it should be felt wide enough to fall into, days when the particular combination of physical pain and institutional frustration and the grinding patience-testing tedium that Thomas had warned him about compounded into something that required real effort to carry. He said he was carrying it. He said he had carried heavier things. She said, "I know you have. But those things were emergencies. Emergencies have their own fuel. This is different. This is slow." He said yes. It is slow. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something that I have been thinking about since Denver." He waited. She said, "What happened in that coffee house, what those 2 young men did and what I did and what you did in response to it, I have been thinking about why it matters beyond the 2 of you specifically, beyond the coffee house and the firm and the councilman and all of it." He said, "Tell me." She said, "There are people like Daniel, like Marcus, all over every city, people who navigate a world that was not designed for them and who do it with more dignity and more competence than the people making it difficult for them will ever understand, and the reason the Bryce Callaways of the world can do what they do is not because they are powerful. It is because the people around them look away." She said, "What I did on Tuesday morning was not remarkable. Any person in that room could have done it. Most of them did not because looking away has a social permission in this culture that it should not have and that only changes when enough people refuse to give it that permission." She said, "I am telling you this because I want you to understand that the fight you are in right now is not only about your job or the Alderman Street permits or Councilman Callaway's campaign donors. It is about whether looking away continues to have permission." Marcus sat with that for a long moment. Outside his window the city hummed in its Friday night way, the particular frequency of a large city in the last weeks of November, people moving through lit streets in the cold, carrying things, going somewhere, the 10,000 ordinary purposes of 10,000 ordinary evenings. He said, "That is a large frame for an ivory envelope and a bad cup of coffee." She said, "All the large things start inside small frames." He said he knew that. He had been a structural assessor for 2 years. He knew what was hidden inside walls. She said, "Yes. Exactly that." They got off the phone a few minutes later and Marcus sat at his table for a while after, not working, just sitting with the accumulated weight and meaning of a week that had asked more of him than most and had also, in ways he was still learning to account for, given him more than he had expected. The map on the wall. The red dots. The load-bearing wall on the 4th floor of the Alderman Street building that someone had removed and plastered over and hoped nobody with the right knowledge would ever find. He had found it. He had written it down. He had put it in a report and submitted it through the correct channels and refused to be moved when the machine pushed back. That was what he did. That was who he was. And that. He understood sitting in his kitchen on a Friday night with the city humming outside his window and a fight in its slow middle stage that was going to require everything he had and perhaps more, was going to have to be enough. Was going to have to be enough. The meeting with Paul Whitmore happened on a Monday morning at a place called the Harbor Grill, a narrow diner 3 blocks from the waterfront that smelled like bacon grease and old wood and the particular comfortable staleness of a room that had been serving the same kinds of people the same kinds of food for 40 years without apology. Paul Whitmore was already there when Marcus arrived, sitting at a corner table with a notebook open and a pen behind his ear and a cup of coffee that suggested he had been there long enough to need a refill. He was in his mid-40s, lean and unremarkable in appearance in the specific way of journalists who have learned that unremarkable is useful, that the ability to sit in a room without commanding attention is a professional asset when your work depends on people saying things to you they might not say if they were being watched. He stood when Marcus came in, which Marcus appreciated without commenting on, and shook his hand with the direct grip of someone who was not performing anything, and said he was glad Marcus had agreed to come. They ordered. Paul Whitmore got his refill. Marcus got black coffee and did not order food because eating at a table where he was about to be interviewed felt like a complication he did not need. Paul opened by saying he was going to be straightforward about what he knew and what he was working on, because he had found over the years that the conversations that produced the most useful results for everyone involved were the ones where both sides understood the territory clearly from the beginning rather than spending time navigating around the edges of things. Marcus said he appreciated that. Paul said he had been tracking the relationship between Cornerstone Development Group and Councilman Raymond Callaway for approximately 8 months. He said Cornerstone had received favorable treatment on 3 separate permit applications in the past 2 years, treatment that was not necessarily improper on its face but that had a pattern to it, a consistency of outcome in Callaway's committee that was statistically unusual when compared with other applicants at similar stages of the process. He said the Alderman Street project was one of 3 developments currently in Cornerstone's pipeline, and that the permit delay created by Marcus's assessment report was the first time in 8 months that a Cornerstone application had encountered any meaningful friction in the process. He said the administrative leave action against Marcus had come to his attention through a source he was not going to name and that it had struck him as the kind of event that warranted a closer look. He said all of this without drama, in the flat informational tone of someone reporting the contents of a filing cabinet, and when he finished he picked up his pen and looked at Marcus and said, "I would like to hear your account of what happened, starting wherever you think the story starts." Marcus thought about Thomas Greer's advice. He thought about what was in the public record and what was in the formal complaint and what was in neither place and required him to characterize motives. He organized his thinking with the same precision he brought to a structural assessment, identifying the load-bearing elements, distinguishing between what he had directly observed and what he had inferred, keeping the 2 categories cleanly separate so that the account was honest in both directions. Honest about what he knew and honest about what he did not. He told Paul about the Tuesday morning at Carver's Coffee House. He described what happened factually and without embellishment, the 2 young men, the blocking, the mockery, the moment Bryce Callaway had put his hands on the table and told Marcus to roll out and let the adults talk, and Caroline's response, and the departure of the 2 young men, and the specific sequence of events that led from that moment to the ivory envelope 4 days later. He told Paul about the Alderman Street assessment, about the 3 findings, about the load-bearing wall and the moisture intrusion and the electrical hazard, about the report he had submitted through standard channels with full documentation. He told Paul about the formal complaint he had filed with the Office of Inspector General. He said everything that was in the public record. He said nothing that required him to characterize Councilman Callaway's motives or Bryce Callaway's motives or anyone else's motives, because motives were inference and inference was Paul Whitmore's job, not his. When he finished, Paul was quiet for a moment, writing in his notebook with the focused economy of someone transcribing essential points rather than every word. Then he looked up and said, "The woman who intervened in the coffee house." Marcus said, "Her name is Dr. Caroline Reyes. She is a former Army combat medic and currently works as a trauma response consultant. She is not employed by the city or by my firm." Paul wrote that down. He asked if Caroline would be willing to speak with him. Marcus said he would ask her. Paul nodded and then asked 3 more questions, about the specific timeline of the permit review, about whether Marcus had had any prior professional contact with anyone connected to Cornerstone Development Group, and about whether he had received any communication from the firm or from anyone at the city about the Alderman Street report prior to the administrative leave letter. Marcus answered the first 2 questions directly. To the third he said, "Everything relevant is in the formal complaint filed with the Inspector General's office, and I would refer you to that document for anything beyond what I have told you today." Paul Whitmore looked at him for a moment with the look of someone evaluating a source and finding it reliable. He said, "You are very careful." Marcus said, "I assess structures for hidden failures." "You learn to be precise about what you can actually see and what you are inferring from the evidence." Paul said, "That is either the most interesting thing a source has ever said to me or the most well prepared." Marcus said, "Those do not have to be different things." Paul smiled at that, the brief genuine smile of someone who finds something unexpectedly engaging, and wrote something in his notebook that Marcus could not read from across the table. They finished their coffees. Paul said he would be in touch about next steps and that he expected the piece would take 3 to 4 weeks to develop properly, that he did not publish things he was not confident in and that confidence required time and multiple sources and verification of every factual claim, and that Marcus should not interpret the timeline as lack of urgency but as the difference between doing the thing right and doing the thing fast. Marcus said he understood. He said he had been doing structural assessments for 2 years and he had learned that the choice between right and fast was almost always a choice between finding the real problem and missing it. Paul said, "Exactly." He paid for both coffees before Marcus could object and said, "Off the record, you are going to be fine." Marcus said, "I am not interested in off-the-record assessments from journalists I have just met." Paul laughed at that, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of someone who had just had something unexpected happen in a conversation they had thought they had mapped. He said, "Fair enough." Marcus wheeled himself out of the harbor grill and into the cold November air and sat for a moment on the sidewalk, the city moving around him in its ordinary Monday morning way, and thought about what had just happened. He had done it right. He had said what was in the record and held the line on everything else, and he had not been moved by the journalist's practiced neutrality or his implied sympathy or his off-the-record assessment, because off-the-record assessments from people with their own interests in the outcome of your story were exactly the kind of thing Thomas Greer had warned him about, and Marcus had been paying attention. He called Thomas from the parking lot, gave him the summary. Thomas said, "That sounds about right." He said, "The journalist asked about the woman from the coffee house." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much does she know?" Marcus said, "Everything." Thomas said, "Is she the kind of person who can handle being written about?" Marcus thought about a woman who had spent 3 tours in combat zones and had looked at 2 young men in a coffee house without blinking and had said, "I have watched people bleed out in the dirt," and had meant it as a plain statement of her qualifications for the moment. He said, "Yes." Thomas said, "Then let her make her own choice about whether to talk to him." He said, "Do not make it for her." Marcus said he knew that. He called Caroline that afternoon. She was between meetings, she said, she had about 10 minutes. He gave her the summary of the Whitmore meeting and passed along the request for an interview. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you think?" He said it was her decision, that it was her name and her account and her choice about how much of it entered the public record. She said, "That is not what I asked." He said, "I think the story is more powerful with you in it." Not because you need to be. Because what you did matters, and the reason it matters is not only what it meant to me. It is what it means to anyone watching two people talk themselves into looking away and then seeing someone choose not to. She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she said, "Send me his contact information." He did. Paul Whitmore and Caroline Reyes spoke 3 days later. Marcus did not ask what was said. Caroline told him afterward that she had given Paul her account of Tuesday morning in full and had answered his questions about her background and her current work and had been careful about characterizing motives in exactly the way Marcus had been careful, and that Paul Whitmore had struck her as someone who understood the difference between a source who was telling the truth and a source who was constructing a narrative, and that she was reasonably confident he was going to handle it with the seriousness it deserved. She said she thought it was going to be a good piece. She said she also thought it was going to make some people in the city very uncomfortable. Marcus said, "Good." She said, "Yes. Good." The weeks between Paul Whitmore's article and its publication were the weeks where Marcus learned the specific and particular discipline of living inside a fight that had no visible daily progress. He woke up every morning and made coffee and looked at the case number taped inside his cabinet door and went to work and did his job and came home and checked his email for anything from the Inspector General's office or from Thomas Greer and went to bed and did it all again. The process ground forward in its institutional way. Thomas had a brief exchange with the firm's counsel about the timeline of the administrative review. The Inspector General's office sent a form letter acknowledging receipt of supporting materials. The firm sent Marcus a message about updating his direct deposit information that was so ordinary it felt almost surreal, the administrative apparatus of an institution that had put him on leave continuing to process him with the automated indifference of a system that did not particularly distinguish between situations. His spine hurt on Tuesdays and Thursdays with a specific radiating persistence that he had learned to manage with a combination of medication and positioning and the kind of focused mental redirection that his rehabilitation therapist had called reframing and that Marcus privately thought of as doing the math on what actually matters. He called his mother on Sundays. She asked about work and he told her what he could, and she listened and said things that were practical and true without being either falsely reassuring or uselessly dark. The balance of a woman who had spent 71 years paying attention and had learned that honesty delivered with care was the most useful thing you could offer someone you loved. She asked about Caroline once in the middle of the 3rd week and Marcus said she was well, she was busy, she had another consultation in Houston the following week. His mother said, "She sounds like a good person to know." Marcus said, "She is." His mother said, "Those are rarer than they should be." He said, "Yes they are." She said nothing else about it and neither did he, but the conversation stayed with him in the way conversations do when they have named something real in the plainest possible language and left it there for you to look at. The article came out on a Thursday morning, 31 days after Marcus had sat across from Paul Whitmore at the Harbor Grill. Marcus found out it had been published not from Paul or from Thomas but from Gerald Okafor, who sent him an email at 7:43 in the morning that said only, "I have read Mr. Whitmore's article. I would like to meet with you this afternoon at 3 o'clock if you are available." Marcus read that email at his kitchen table with his first coffee of the morning and understood that 31 days of patient grinding invisible work had just produced a visible result. He replied that 3 o'clock was fine. Then he opened the paper's website and read the article from beginning to end, twice, the way he read structural reports, carefully and sequentially, looking for what was solid and what was not. It was a good piece. Paul Whitmore had done what he said he would do, which was take the time to do it right. The article laid out the relationship between Cornerstone Development Group and Councilman Calloway's committee with the precision of someone who had spent 8 months documenting a pattern and was now presenting it with all the supporting evidence visible and properly sourced. It described the 3 permit applications that had received favorable treatment. It described the Alderman Street assessment and Marcus's 3 findings. It described the administrative leave action and its timeline. It quoted Marcus briefly and accurately, nothing that was not in the public record, nothing that characterized motives, just the facts of the assessment and the facts of the sequence. It quoted Caroline in 3 sentences that were among the most precise 3 sentences Marcus had read in a long time. She had said, "I sat in a room and watched someone with power use it to reduce a person who had given more to this country than those 2 young men will give in their entire lives, and I made a choice that any person in that room could have made. Most of them did not. I do not think that is acceptable, and I did not act as if it were." The article described those 3 sentences as belonging to Dr. Caroline Reyes, former Army combat medic and current trauma response consultant, and identified her as the woman who had intervened at Carver's Coffee House on the Tuesday morning that began the chain of events the article was documenting. Marcus read those 3 sentences 3 times. He thought about the specific economy of them, the way she had said exactly what she meant in exactly the words it required, no more and no less, the same quality he had noticed in the coffee house, the same precision that had made him trust her from the beginning. He set his phone down on the table. He looked at the map on his wall. The red dots. The accumulated record of hidden things found and named. He thought about the load-bearing wall on the 4th floor of the Alderman Street building, the one someone had removed and plastered over, and he thought about what happened to structures when you removed the things that held them up and pretended the removal had not occurred. He thought about how long that could go on before the surface gave way. He thought about what it meant to be the person who found it and wrote it down. He picked up his phone and called Caroline. She answered immediately, which meant she had already read it. He said, "You saw it?" She said, "I saw it." He said, "The 3 sentences." She said, "I meant them." He said, "I know." There was a pause and then he said, "Thank you." She said, "You already thanked me for something I did for myself." He said, "This one was for me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are welcome." Outside his window the city was doing its Thursday morning thing, the particular rhythm of a city on a weekday in late November, the year contracting toward its end, the light thin and reliable in the way of late autumn light that has stopped pretending to be anything warmer than it is. Marcus Webb sat at his kitchen table and let himself feel, for a moment, the specific and unusual sensation of having done everything right in a situation that had been designed to make doing everything right as difficult as possible. It did not feel like victory. Not yet. There were still the meeting with Gerald Okafor and the Inspector General's process and Thomas Greer's careful ongoing work and all the unpredictable machinery of consequences still unspooling through the city's various offices and chambers. But it felt like something. It felt like the thing that comes just before the thing you have been working toward, that particular quality of pressure that buildings feel just before the hidden structural failure is finally named and addressed and repaired. Not the resolution. The moment just before the resolution. The moment when you can finally see the shape of what is going to happen because you have done enough of the work to earn the right to see it. He finished his coffee. He got dressed. He went to work. That afternoon, sitting in his office with the 3 o'clock meeting with Gerald Okafor still 2 hours away, Marcus allowed himself to think about what the article actually meant in practical terms. Not the emotional weight of it, though that was real and present and deserved acknowledgement. The practical architecture of what had just changed. Before the article, the situation had been a private complaint inside an institutional process, invisible to everyone except the people directly involved, with all the power asymmetry that invisibility creates when one side has influence and the other has documentation. After the article, the situation was public, named, sourced, and placed in a context that connected the specific action against Marcus to a larger pattern of behavior that 8 months of Whitmore's reporting had established. That context was everything. A retaliatory administrative action against one employee was a manageable problem for an institution if it stayed inside the institution. The same action, reported as part of an 8-month pattern of a city council member protecting a development company's financial interests, was a different order of problem entirely. Marcus understood this the way he understood structural forces, not as abstraction but as the concrete reality of which things would hold and which things would not when sufficient pressure was applied. He also understood that the article being published was not the end of anything. It was a shift in the balance of forces, significant and real but not determinative on its own. The Inspector General's process was still in motion. Thomas Greer's work with the firm's counsel was still in motion. Councilman Callaway had not yet responded publicly to the article's findings, which meant that response was coming and its shape was not yet known. Gerald Okafor had called a 3 o'clock meeting, which could mean several things and which Marcus would not characterize until he was sitting in the room and could assess the actual terrain. The day was still unfinished. The work was still unfinished. He kept his head down and worked until 2:45 and then wheeled himself to the elevator and went up to the 4th floor where Gerald Okafor's office occupied the corner with the city view and the good afternoon light that Marcus had always thought was wasted on a man who spent most of his time looking at his desk. Gerald Okafor's assistant, a young woman named Patricia who had been with the firm for 6 years and who Marcus had always found to be sharp and quietly perceptive in ways her job title did not fully capture, looked up when he came in and said Gerald was expecting him and gestured toward the office door with the expression of someone who knew more about what was on the other side of it than she was going to say. Marcus thanked her and went in. Gerald Okafor was standing at his window when Marcus entered, which was unusual. Gerald was a desk man, a sitter, someone who conducted meetings from behind the specific authority of a surface covered in organized papers. Standing at the window suggested a different kind of conversation, one that had not yet found its footing. He turned when he heard Marcus come in and there was something in his face that Marcus read carefully before sitting down in the chair across from the desk. Gerald Okafor was not a man who showed much. 22 years of running a firm that worked with the city on sensitive assessments had given him the practiced composure of someone who had learned that displaying feeling in professional contexts was a strategic choice rather than a reflex. But there was something there, behind the composure. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a man who had made a decision he had considered reasonable at the time and was now sitting with the particular discomfort of understanding that reasonable and right are not always the same thing. He sat down. He said, "I read the article this morning." Marcus said he knew. Gerald said, "It is a thorough piece of reporting." Marcus said it was. Gerald looked at his desk for a moment, at the organized papers, at the particular geometry of a workspace that had been maintained with consistent care over a long career. Then he looked up at Marcus and said, "I owe you an explanation." Marcus said, "I am listening." Gerald said that when the communication from Callaway's office had arrived, he had made a calculation. He said he had told himself it was a procedural step, a standard response to an external complaint, that it protected Marcus as much as it protected the firm, that it gave the process room to work without forcing a confrontation that might escalate in ways that were difficult to control. He said he had told himself several things and he had believed most of them at the time, and he was honest enough now to say that he had also known, on a level he had chosen not to examine too closely, that the calculation was not purely procedural. That there was an element of it that was about protecting relationships that the firm depended on. That putting Marcus on leave had been, among other things, the path of least institutional resistance. He said this without looking away, which Marcus respected, and he said it in the plain honest language of a man who had decided that a partial accounting was not worth the energy it cost to maintain. Marcus sat with it for a moment. He thought about what Caroline had said about people who looked away and the social permission that looking away required. He thought about the perimeter waiters at the office, the careful colleagues who made eye contact half a second too long and then moved on. He thought about what it cost to be honest and what it cost not to be, and which cost you could actually live with over time. He said, "Gerald, I appreciate that." Gerald nodded. Marcus said, "The question in front of us now is not what the calculation was 3 weeks ago. It is what the firm is going to do with what the article has made visible." Gerald said, "Yes." He said, "I have already spoken to the firm's counsel this morning. He said the administrative leave action was being rescinded effective immediately. He said the firm was prepared to cooperate fully with the Inspector General's review and to provide any documentation requested. He said the firm was also going to issue a statement affirming the integrity and accuracy of Marcus's Alderman Street assessment and supporting the findings contained in that report. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the Alderman Street permits?" Gerald said, "That is a matter for the city. The firm's role is the assessment." Marcus said, "The firm's assessment found 3 significant deficiencies." Gerald said, "Yes, it did." Marcus said, "And those findings stand?" Gerald said, "Those findings stand." He said it without hesitation, with the clarity of someone who has burned through the last of the ambiguity and arrived at something he can state plainly. Marcus nodded. He said he appreciated the directness. Gerald said he should have been direct 3 weeks earlier and that he understood the difference between an apology and an action and that the action was what mattered. Marcus said he agreed with that. They shook hands across the desk. Marcus wheeled himself back to the elevator and down to his floor and to his office and sat at his desk and looked out over the loading dock where the forklift was making its steady backing up beep in the afternoon cold. He called Thomas Greer. He gave him the summary of the meeting. Thomas was quiet for a moment and then said, "The rescission should be in writing, with a date, submitted to the union office by end of business today." Marcus said he would request it. Thomas said, "Good." Then he said, "You did this right, Marcus? The whole thing? Every step?" Marcus said, "I had help." Thomas said, "Everyone does. The question is whether you are good enough to recognize it and use it well." He said, "You were." Marcus called Caroline next. She picked up on the second ring and said, "I heard." He said, "The rescission is official." She said, "And Gerald?" He said, "He was honest." She said, "That matters." He said, "It does. It does not undo what he did, but it matters." She said, "Yes. That is what accountability looks like when it works. Not the erasure of the thing. The honest confronting of it and the repair of what can be repaired." He said, "You sound like you have thought about this a lot." She said, "I have watched a lot of institutions handle things badly and a few handle them well, and the difference is almost always whether the people at the top are willing to say out loud what they already know privately." He said, "Gerald got there." She said, "Eventually." He said, "Eventually counts." She said, "Yes. Eventually counts." The evening had come on while they were talking, the city going dark in the particular way of late November evenings, the lights coming up in offices and apartments and the streets going bright in the cold. Marcus sat at his desk in the building where he had worked for 2 years and looked out over the loading dock and thought about the map on his wall at home with its accumulation of red dots. He thought about all the hidden things he had found and named. He thought about a load-bearing wall on the 4th floor that someone had removed and tried to make invisible and that he had found anyway, because he was good at his work and because good work done honestly had a persistence to it that attempts to bury it could delay but could not permanently defeat. He thought about a Tuesday morning and a coffee house and a woman with a notebook and cold tea and the specific unhesitating quality of her decision to stand up and what that decision had set in motion and where it had arrived. He thought about what it meant to stand in the particular way she had stood, not dramatically, not for an audience, not out of a need to be the person who stood, but simply because the moment required it and she was the kind of person who did what moments required. He thought about what it had taken to become that kind of person and what it had cost and what it had made possible. He turned off his desk lamp. He put on his jacket. He went home through streets that were familiar in the way that streets become familiar when you have navigated them long enough, when the distances between things have become part of your body's knowledge, when the city has stopped being a place you are moving through and become a place you actually live. He stopped at a restaurant 2 blocks from his apartment and ate dinner alone at a table by the window and watched the street and thought about nothing in particular and everything in general, the way you think when the acute stage of something is over and the longer and quieter stage that follows has not yet fully declared its shape. He paid and went home. He stood at his kitchen cabinet and looked at the case number written on the piece of paper taped next to the fire extinguisher. Still there. Still active. Still in process. Not finished yet. But real. He made tea and sat at his table and allowed himself, in the privacy of a quiet evening, the specific and undemonstrative satisfaction of a man who had done the right things in a difficult situation and was beginning, cautiously and without fanfare, to see the results. Cautiously and without fanfare, to see the results. The rescission letter arrived the following morning, delivered by email at 8:52 with Gerald Okafor's signature and a carbon copy to Thomas Greer and to the firm's counsel and to the Human Resources file. Marcus read it once, forwarded it to Thomas with a brief note confirming receipt, and printed a hard copy which he placed in the folder he had been maintaining since the first Friday, the folder that had begun as a single document on his kitchen table late at night and had grown over the past weeks into something substantial and organized, a record of every communication and every action and every date, the complete structural documentation of a situation that had been designed to leave no visible record of the forces that had caused it. He filed the rescission letter at the front of the folder. He labeled the folder with the date range and the case number and put it in the drawer of his desk at home, where it would remain until the Inspector General's process was complete and Thomas Greer told him the matter was formally resolved. That might take another month. It might take 3. Thomas had been clear about the timeline and Marcus had adjusted his expectations accordingly, the way you adjust your expectations about everything when you have spent enough time learning the difference between the pace at which things should happen and the pace at which they actually do. What mattered now, Thomas had said in their Monday call, was that the record was established, the rescission was documented, the firm's statement supporting Marcus's assessment findings was on the public record, and the Inspector General had everything needed to complete a thorough review. The machinery was running. The work was done. What remained was the patience. Marcus had patience. He had learned it the way he had learned everything that mattered in the past 2 years, not as a quality he had naturally possessed but as a discipline he had developed because the alternative was despair and despair was not useful and he had never had much tolerance for things that were not useful. He came back to his full duties at the firm the Monday after the rescission, walked back into the building the same way he had walked out of it 3 weeks before, through the accessible entrance on the east side, up the elevator to the second floor, to the office with the window that looked over the loading dock and the afternoon light that came in at the useful angle. Patricia, Gerald's assistant, gave him a small nod when she passed his door that morning that contained within it the entire compressed weight of a person who had been watching a situation with more attention than her position required and was glad about how it had resolved. He nodded back. His colleagues were different now too, in the specific way that colleagues are different after a situation that has required everyone to show more of themselves than routine work demands. Some of them had shown something good. A structural engineer named Raymond, who had the office at the end of the hall and who Marcus had always known as technically excellent and personally reserved, had sent Marcus a brief email during the leave period, 3 sentences, saying he had worked alongside Marcus for 2 years and had always found his assessments thorough and his integrity unquestionable and that he wanted Marcus to know that. Marcus had read that email several times. He had not replied immediately because the right response required more than he could give in the moment, but he had replied eventually, simply and directly, saying it had mattered more than Raymond probably knew. Raymond had replied with one word. Good. That exchange, brief and plain and carrying the compressed weight of 2 people who did not speak easily but meant what they said, was one of the things Marcus thought about when he thought about what the whole situation had cost and what it had returned. Other colleagues had been less forthcoming, had maintained their perimeter positions through the leave period and had returned to ordinary professional interaction after the rescission as though the interval had not occurred. Marcus held no particular feeling about this. Perimeter waiters were part of every landscape. You could not build a world without them, and you could not rely on them when things were burning, and you learned to account for both of those facts without making either of them more than they were. December came in cold and clear, the kind of early December that feels like a promise of what winter is actually capable of, the air sharp and definite and the sky a hard specific blue that made the city look like a drawing of itself. Marcus drove out to his mother's house on the first Sunday of the month and helped her put up the outside lights, which was a task she had asked for his help with every year since the fall that had taken him off the job, not because she could not manage it herself but because she had decided in her particular quiet way that it was important to find things to ask him for, to keep the current of ordinary need running between them in both directions, to make sure that the injury had not turned the relationship into something one-sided and therefore smaller than it should be. He strung the lights along the porch railing from his chair, which required a set of adaptations that he had worked out over 2 years and that were now simply the way the task was done, efficient and unremarkable, and his mother brought out hot chocolate and they sat on the porch in the cold for a while and looked at the lights and talked about ordinary things, about his cousin's new apartment and the neighbor's dog and the roof repair she had been putting off since September. She did not ask about the firm or the Inspector General or Councilman Calloway. She had asked about all of those things in their Sunday phone calls and had received honest answers and had filed them in the way she filed important things, carefully and without drama, available when needed. Today was for ordinary things. Marcus was glad of it. On the drive home he called Caroline, who was in the city for the week, her Houston consultation finished, no travel scheduled until January. She picked up on the first ring. He said he was driving and could not talk long. She said she was making dinner and could talk as long as he wanted. He said he had been thinking about something and wanted to ask her about it. She said go ahead. He said, the day you came into Carver's. Before everything happened. What were you working on in the notebook? She was quiet for a moment and he thought she might not answer, that the question was too personal or too tangential or simply too far from the immediate practical concerns that had dominated their conversations since they met. Then she said, I was writing about a patient. He waited. She said, not a current patient. Someone I lost in the field during my second tour. A soldier named Marcus, actually. He went very still in his seat. She said, different Marcus. She said it gently, understanding the weight of the coincidence. She said, he died during an operation that should have been survivable, died because of a decision made by someone who had more authority than judgment, and I had been carrying him for a long time and I had finally decided to write it down, to put it somewhere outside myself, because carrying things inside gets heavier and writing them down gives them a fixed shape and a fixed weight, and you can put fixed things down for a moment in a way you cannot put formless things down. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, did it help? She said, yes. Writing it down always helps. It does not fix the thing. It just gives you somewhere to put it while you figure out what to do with it. He said he understood that. She said she knew he did. He said, I have been thinking about writing something down myself. She said, about the fall. He said, about all of it? The fire and the fall and the rehabilitation and the 2 years since. She said, that sounds like the right time for it. He said he did not know what form it would take. She said form was the last thing to worry about. Form followed from content, always, and the content was already there, it just needed to be written. He said, you sound like you have done this before. She said, I tell every person I work with in trauma response the same thing eventually. The story you carry inside costs more than the story you put somewhere outside yourself. He said, is that in a manual somewhere? She said, it is now. He laughed. She did too, the real unguarded laugh that he had heard only a few times and that he had noticed each time because it was different from her professional voice, the way the true load-bearing structure of a building was different from the finished surface, more basic, more essential, the thing that was actually holding everything else up. He said he would call her later in the week. She said she would be at Thornwood on Wednesday morning if he wanted to meet. He said he would be there. He drove the rest of the way home through streets that were strung with December lights, the city doing its annual accommodation of the season, the ordinary architecture of the year's end settling over everything, and thought about a soldier named Marcus who had died in the field during a survivable operation, and about the woman who had been carrying him for years and had come to a coffee house on a Tuesday morning to write him down and had ended up in the middle of something entirely different. Something she had not planned and had not hesitated about and had not once, in all the weeks since, seemed to regret. He parked and went inside and sat at his kitchen table and opened his laptop and made a new document and sat with the cursor blinking in the empty space for a long moment before he typed the first sentence. He wrote about the building on Decatur Street. He wrote about the call coming in, the third-floor residential fire, the child reported trapped, the standard entry through the front door with the team spread behind him and the heat above average but manageable, and nothing in the initial read that said this was going to be different from 100 other calls. He wrote about the floor. The moment of absence where solid ground had been. The 12-foot fall that was over before he had time to understand it was happening. He wrote about the basement, about the dark and the heat and the particular quality of silence in his legs that he had known immediately and had named in his own mind without yet having the vocabulary his doctors would give him later. He wrote about waiting for his crew to find him and about the discipline of keeping his mind on the present moment, the breath in and the breath out, the task of staying conscious and calm, the training that had become reflex. He wrote all of it, slowly and precisely, in the plain language of someone reporting what actually happened, and he did not stop until he had written through the hospital and the rehabilitation and the chair and the 2 years of learning to navigate a world that had been designed without him in mind. He wrote for 3 hours. When he stopped, the apartment was dark except for the laptop screen and the lights of the city coming through the window and the small green indicator light on the smoke detector in the hallway, and he sat in that partial darkness and read what he had written, the way he read structural reports, looking for the places where the account was honest and the places where it was not quite honest, the places where he had said what happened and the places where he had said what was easier to say than what happened. He found a few of the second kind and went back and changed them. He saved the document. He made tea. He sat with it and looked at the city lights and thought about fixed shapes and fixed weights and the difference between carrying something inside and putting it somewhere outside where it could be seen and known and set down when necessary. He thought about what it had taken to become the person sitting in this chair in this apartment on this December night with this document on his screen and this fight mostly won and this unexpected person named Caroline Reyes in his life in the particular way she was in it, undefined and real and something he had not planned and was not going to force into a shape before it was ready to declare its own. He thought about his crew in the photograph on the wall. About Raymond's 3-sentence email. About his mother stringing lights in the cold. About Thomas Greer with his folded hands and his 22 years of this kind of work. About Paul Whitmore asking the right questions in the right order and taking the time to do it right. He thought about all the ordinary people who had been, in their various ways and at their various costs, willing to see what was true and act accordingly. He thought about how rare that was and how much it mattered and how much it had mattered to him specifically over the past weeks, to know that there were people who would run toward the fire, who would stand up in a coffee house, who would send a 3-sentence email, who would make calls on a weekend on behalf of a man they had met 4 days before. He finished his tea. He washed the cup. He went to bed. Outside his window the city did its December night thing, the particular hum of a city that had stopped pretending to be warm and was being itself instead, cold and lit and full of stories, some ending, and some beginning and some still in the long unresolved middle where most of the actual living happened. Marcus Webb lay in the dark of his bedroom and breathed steadily and let the day be over. Tomorrow there would be more work. There would be more waiting. There would be the Inspector General's process still grinding forward and the Alderman Street permits still unresolved and the question of what consequences if any would reach Councilman Calloway and his orbit, and there would be Wednesday at Thornwood and whatever that meant and whatever it was becoming. There was all of that ahead. But tonight the day was over and the document was saved and the story was somewhere outside him for the first time, fixed and shaped and set down, and that was enough for one night. That was more than enough. The Wednesday at Thornwood arrived with the first real snow of the season, not the tentative early flurries that had come and gone in November but actual committed snow, the kind that settled and stayed, that turned the city's angles soft and made the familiar streets look briefly like something from a different story. Marcus drove carefully, the modified van handling the changed roads with the reliable competence of a well-maintained machine, and found parking in the structure 2 blocks from Thornwood that had an accessible space on the ground level with a direct path to the sidewalk that did not require navigating a curb, which he noted as he always noted such things, not with gratitude exactly but with the specific recognition of a person who has learned to appreciate the practical details that other people take for granted because they have never had reason to count them. Caroline was already there when he arrived, which he had come to understand was simply how she moved through the world, always slightly ahead of the scheduled moment, positioned and ready, a quality he recognized from his own years on the job where being 2 minutes early had been the difference between prepared and scrambling. She had a tea in front of her and his usual black coffee already ordered and sitting across the table, which he registered without commenting on because commenting on it would make it a thing when it was not a thing. It was just the kind of attention that some people paid and other people did not, and she paid it the same way she paid attention to everything, precisely and without performance. He settled at the table. He said, "It snowed." She said, "I noticed." He said, "The city looks different." She said, "It looks more honest." He thought about that. He said, "How so?" She said, "Snow covers the things people put on surfaces to make them look like something they are not. The real structure shows through." He looked at her. She was looking out the window at the white street with the particular expression he had learned to read over the past weeks, the expression of someone whose mind was working on several levels simultaneously and who was comfortable with that, who did not need to resolve all the levels into a single visible thought before speaking. He said, "I wrote about the building on Decatur Street." She looked at him then, the full direct attention that was one of the things he had come to understand about her, the way she turned toward what mattered without ceremony. She said, "How did it feel?" He said, "Like setting something down that I had been carrying in the wrong way." She nodded. She said, "The wrong way being?" He said, "Close to the body. The way you carry something when you are not sure you can put it down without losing it." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I know it does not disappear when I put it down. It just stops weighing against everything else I am trying to carry at the same time." She said, "Yes. That is exactly what it does." They drank their coffees and teas in the comfortable silence that had become natural between them over the past weeks, the silence of 2 people who had moved past the stage of filling quiet with words and had arrived at the stage where quiet was simply part of the conversation, equal in weight to the spoken parts and sometimes more honest. Outside the snow continued, steady and indifferent, the city going white and soft around them while they sat in the warm interior of Thornwood and were, for a Tuesday morning, simply 2 people sharing a table and a silence and the particular unhurried quality of time that belongs to no emergency. Marcus thought about the soldier named Marcus who had died in a survivable operation and about the woman across from him who had been carrying him in a notebook for years and had come to a coffee house on a Tuesday morning to put him down. He thought about what it meant to carry people and what it meant to put them down and what it meant to find, in the putting down, not loss but the space for something else, something that could not have fit while the carrying was filling all available room. He said, "What was his name?" She looked at him. He said, "The soldier." She said, "Marcus Tyrrell. From Savannah. He was 24. He had a younger sister he sent money to every month and a dog back home named General that his mother was keeping, and he was planning to go to college on the GI Bill when he got back and study environmental science because he had grown up near a river that had been damaged by industrial runoff and he wanted to understand the systems well enough to help fix them. Marcus sat with that for a long moment. The specificity of it? The money sent to his sister. The dog named General. The river. The environmental science degree that had never happened. He said, "You remembered all of that." She said, "I remember everything about everyone I have lost." He said, "That must be heavy." She said, "It used to be. Now it is more like a record. The names and the details and the lives they were living. I keep the record because someone should, and because keeping it means they are not only the way they died. They are also everything they were before and everything they were planning to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is one of the most important things anyone has said to me in a long time." She looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was different from the professional precision and different from the warm directness, and was something quieter and more private, something that had not been fully visible in the earlier weeks when they were in the middle of the fight and the fight had been consuming most of the available space. She said, "I think you are one of the most important people I have met in a long time." She said it the way she said everything that mattered, plainly and without hedging, the words landing in the space between them with the specific weight of something meant exactly as stated. Marcus looked at her across the table in the snowy quiet of a Wednesday morning in December with the coffee going warm in his hands and said, "I think so too." He said it the same way. Plainly. Without hedging. The words meaning exactly what they said. Outside the snow kept falling, and inside Thornwood the morning continued its ordinary Wednesday business, and at a table by the back wall 2 people who had found each other in the aftermath of a moment of ordinary decency sat with the quiet between them and let something that had been building for weeks finally occupy the space it had been moving toward all along. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was simply the honest recognition of 2 people who had been paying close enough attention to see what was true. Which was, in the end, exactly how Caroline Reyes did everything. And exactly how Marcus Webb had learned to do everything too. And exactly how Marcus Webb had learned to do everything too. The Inspector General's report came out in the second week of January, on a Tuesday, which Marcus noticed because Tuesdays had taken on a particular weight in his calendar since the morning at Carver's Coffee House, since the specific Tuesday 2 months ago that had set all of this in motion. He was at his desk at the firm when Thomas Greer called to tell him, and he heard it in Thomas's voice before the words arrived, the particular quality of controlled satisfaction that a man develops after 22 years of fighting these kinds of fights, the satisfaction that does not perform itself but is real and present underneath the professional steadiness. Thomas said the report had found sufficient evidence to support a formal referral of Councilman Raymond Callaway to the City Ethics Board for investigation of improper use of his council office to benefit a campaign donor. He said the referral was not a finding of guilt and that the Ethics Board process had its own timeline and its own standards of evidence and that the outcome was not guaranteed. He said those things because they were true and because Thomas Greer was a man who did not allow the relief of partial progress to create false certainty about what remained. But he also said, and this matters, Marcus, this is real. The referral is public record. It will be reported. The Alderman Street permits are on hold pending the completion of the ethics review. Cornerstone Development Group has already retained additional counsel, which suggests they are concerned. None of this is the end, but it is unambiguously a result, and you are entitled to let it be a result for a moment before we go back to work. Marcus sat at his desk and looked out over the loading dock where the forklift was parked and idle in the January cold, the lot dusted with the remnant of last week's snow gone gray at the edges, and he let it be a result for the moment Thomas had authorized. He thought about the ivory envelope. He thought about the letter in its careful institutional language, the language of procedural review, of conflict of interest, of positions the firm found itself in. He thought about the 14 days between that Friday and the day Gerald Okafor had rescinded it in his corner office with the city view and the honest accounting that had cost him something to deliver. He thought about the case number taped inside the cabinet door next to the fire extinguisher. He thought about Thomas Greer with his folded hands and his old carpet office and his 22 years of fighting the kinds of fights that most people looked away from. He thought about Adrian Foster at the Inspector General's office, whose careful language had told him more than her words, whose faith in the independence of the process had turned out to be justified in the way that faith in good institutions is justified when people inside those institutions do their jobs with integrity. He thought about all of it and then he called Caroline. She answered on the first ring. He said, "The referral came through." She said, "I know. Thomas called me first." He said, "He called you first." She said, "I think he wanted to make sure someone was available to manage your reaction in case it went the other way." He said, "I do not need managing." She said, "I know that and Thomas knows that. I think he called me because he has been doing this for 22 years and he understands that good news is sometimes harder to receive than bad news when you have been braced for bad news for a long time." Marcus thought about that. He said, "That is a very precise observation." She said, "Thomas Greer is a very precise man." He said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Relieved. Genuinely and without qualification. I know it is not finished. I know the ethics board has its own process and its own timeline and the outcome is not certain. But the referral is real and it means that what happened was seen and named by people with the authority to see and name it, and that matters regardless of what comes next." He said, "It changes the shape of it." She said, "Yes. It changes the shape of it." That was, he thought, the right description. Not victory. Not resolution. A change in the shape of the thing, from a problem being absorbed in silence into a problem being addressed in public by the mechanisms that existed specifically to address it. That was what the past 2 months had been working toward. Not revenge. Not vindication in the dramatic sense. Just the shape of the thing changing from hidden to visible, from private injury to public record, from the particular kind of power that operates in darkness to the particular kind of accountability that requires light. He thanked Thomas that afternoon in a longer call, thanked him with the specific directness of someone who understood what the work had actually cost in time and attention and professional energy and who was not going to pretend otherwise. Thomas accepted the thanks in the same spirit, directly and without deflection, and said that Marcus had been an unusually good client, which in Thomas's vocabulary of praise was approximately equivalent to exceptional, and that he hoped they would not need to work together again in this particular context but that if they did he would be available. Marcus said he hoped so too on both counts. He said one more thing before they got off the phone. He said, "The colleague who sent me the email. Raymond. During the leave period." Thomas said he remembered, Marcus had mentioned him. Marcus said, "I want to make sure that is part of the record somewhere. That there was someone inside the firm who saw what was happening and said so." Thomas said, "It is in the notes." He said, "The people who stand up matter too. Not only for the outcomes but for what they make possible for the next person who faces the same situation." Marcus said he knew that. He said it was one of the things he had been thinking about writing. Thomas said, "Write it?" He said it the way he said most things, flat and direct and meaning exactly what he said, and Marcus took it the same way, as an instruction from someone whose instructions were worth following. The ethics board process began its preliminary review in the third week of January. Marcus was not a direct party to that process, which had its own investigators and its own procedures and which would proceed at the pace of official bodies regardless of the urgency felt by anyone outside it. What he knew from Thomas and from Paul Whitmore's continuing coverage, which had become a series of pieces rather than a single article, each one adding another layer to the documented pattern of Callaway's committee behavior. Each one sourced from records and from people who had decided that the cost of remaining silent was no longer lower than the cost of speaking. The series was being read. Marcus knew this not from the numbers, which Paul occasionally mentioned in passing with the mild satisfaction of someone whose work was finding its audience, but from the responses. From the emails that arrived through the firm's public contact address addressed to Marcus specifically, from people he did not know, people who had had their own encounters with the machinery Paul's articles were describing, people who had absorbed their own ivory envelopes and their own administrative actions and their own careful institutional language, and who had seen in Marcus's account a reflection of their own experience and had found something in that reflection that made them want to say so. He read every one of those emails. He replied to most of them, briefly and directly, saying that he was glad the account had meant something and that he hoped things were better for them than they had been. Some of them wrote back. A few of those exchanges became actual conversations, longer and more substantial, the kind that happen when two people discover they are fluent in the same specific language, the language of having been on the receiving end of power exercised without accountability and having chosen to push back rather than absorb. One of those exchanges was with a woman named Denise Okafor, no relation to Gerald, who was a building inspector for a neighboring municipality and who had faced a situation 3 years ago that had enough structural similarities to Marcus's that reading about his case had felt, she said, like reading a document about her own life written by someone who had been in the room. She had absorbed her situation rather than fighting it. She said she had told herself it was the practical choice, that the cost of fighting was too high and the outcome uncertain, and that she had a mortgage and a daughter in middle school, and that those facts had to be weighed against the principle of the thing. She said she had been telling herself that for 3 years and that it had cost her something she was only now beginning to understand the full price of. She said reading about Marcus had made her want to understand whether it was too late to do anything about her own situation. Marcus read her email twice. He forwarded it to Thomas Greer with a brief note asking whether Thomas had capacity to take a preliminary inquiry. Thomas replied the same day. He said yes. He said, "Send her my number." Marcus did. He did not know what would come of it, whether Denise Okafor's situation had enough documentation and enough time remaining in whatever applicable process to go anywhere, whether Thomas would find something to work with or would have to tell her honestly that the window had closed. He did not know any of that. What he knew was that the chain did not have to end with him, that the thing he had done and the way he had done it and the record that Paul Whitmore had put into public view had already reached someone else who needed to find the possibility of doing the same thing, and that the possibility of doing the same thing was now a little more visible and a little less unimaginable than it had been before. That felt like something. Not the same something as the Inspector General's referral. Not the institutional formal documented result that Thomas had called to deliver on that Tuesday morning. But a different kind of result, less visible and harder to measure and in some ways more important, the kind of result that happened in the spaces between the official processes, in the email exchanges and the phone calls and the quiet conversations between people who had found each other through the public record of someone else's decision to stop absorbing and start pushing back. Caroline had a name for this. She called it the downstream effect, the way that one person's choice to act with integrity in a specific visible situation created the possibility of the same choice for people watching from a distance, people who needed to see the thing done before they could fully believe it was possible to do. She had spent 5 years as a trauma response consultant watching institutions fail the people inside them and watching other people inside those same institutions decide to do something about the failure, and she had noticed over and over again that the deciding to do something was almost never a fully independent act, that it almost always happened in the wake of someone else having done something similar, that courage was in part a communicable quality, that it spread through communities and organizations and cities the way structural integrity spread through well-built buildings, each element reinforcing the ones around it, the whole becoming more reliable than any individual part. Marcus thought about this on a Thursday evening in late January, sitting at his kitchen table with the document about the building on Decatur Street open on his screen, the document that had grown over the past weeks into something longer and more substantial than he had expected, something that was beginning to feel less like a private record and more like a thing that had a shape and a direction of its own, the way buildings had shapes and directions that were determined not by the wishes of the people inside them but by the structural logic of the materials and the forces acting on them. He had written about the fire and the fall and the hospital and the rehabilitation. He had written about the 2 years of learning to navigate a world that had not been designed for him and about the specific textures of that learning, the distances between things and the angles of ramps and the precise geography of accessibility in a city that practiced it imperfectly and unevenly and with varying degrees of genuine understanding versus performative compliance. He had written about Carver's Coffee House and the Tuesday Morning and Caroline and the Ivory Envelope and Thomas Greer and all of it, the whole chain, written it in the plain honest language he had been developing across the weeks of sitting at this table in the partial dark with the city humming outside. He was not sure what it was yet. He was not sure whether it was a memoir or a testimony or something else that did not have a name yet or that had a name he had not learned. He was not sure it mattered. What mattered was that it was honest and that it was his and that every time he added to it he felt the specific sensation he had described to Caroline, the sensation of setting something down that he had been carrying in the wrong way, close to the body, in the place where carried things pressed against everything else and made everything else harder. He saved the document. He looked at the map on the wall with its red dots, the accumulated record of hidden things found and named in 2 years of structural work. He thought about what it meant to find hidden things. He thought about what it meant to name them. He thought about the load-bearing wall on the 4th floor of the Alderman Street building and about the permit that was still on hold and about the development company that had retained additional counsel and about Councilman Callaway whose name was now attached to a public ethics referral in a way it had not been attached to anything 2 months ago. He thought about the chain of events that a single Tuesday morning had set in motion and about all the ordinary people at each link of that chain who had made the choice to do the thing rather than look away. He thought about what the downstream effect of all of it might be, how far it might reach, how many Denise Ockefers might be out there reading a public account and finding in it the reflection of their own experience and the possibility of their own action. He did not know the answer to that. No one ever knew the answer to that. The downstream effect was by definition what you could not see from where you were standing. You could only know that it existed, that choices made in full view of the people watching always reached further than the person making them could trace, that the decision to act with integrity in a specific visible situation was never only about that situation but about all the situations it made possible afterward, in the people who had been watching and waiting and needing to see the thing done before they could believe it could be done. He closed the laptop. He made tea. He stood at his window and looked at the January city, cold and lit, the winter settled fully in now, the streets cleared of snow but the air still carrying its hard specific edge, the year new and not yet fully committed to what it was going to be. He thought about Wednesday at Thornwood and the snow falling outside and Caroline across the table saying plainly what was true and him saying it back and the thing between them occupying the space it had been moving toward. He thought about what it meant to find something you had not been looking for in the middle of something you had not chosen, to discover in the aftermath of a fall the specific and unexpected gift of a life that was smaller in some ways and larger in others than the life you had planned and that was, in the final honest accounting, more essentially yours than the planned life would ever have been. He sipped his tea. Outside a city bus moved slowly down his street, its lights bright in the dark, carrying whoever it carried toward wherever they were going, the ordinary transportation of ordinary people through an ordinary January night. Marcus Webb stood at his window and watched it pass and felt, in the quiet of his apartment with the document saved and the tea warm and the year still new and the fight mostly won and the things ahead still unresolved but no longer invisible, the particular and specific satisfaction of someone who had found a hidden structural failure, named it accurately, written it into the record, and refused to be moved by the forces that had preferred it to remain hidden. That was the work. That had always been the work. And the work, he understood standing at that window, was never finished. But it was always worth doing. Every last careful honest inch of it. There were practical things still to manage in the weeks that followed and Marcus managed them with the same methodical attention he had brought to everything since the beginning. The Ethics Board sent a formal notice to Councilman Callaway in the last week of January, a fact that Paul Whitmore reported and that produced the first public statement from Callaway's office, a carefully worded 3-paragraph release that used the words "looking forward to cooperating with the process and confident the review will confirm my record of public service and committed to the highest standards of ethical conduct" in proportions that told Marcus everything about the internal state of A man who had not expected to be here and was now managing the distance between where he was and where he had assumed he would remain. Thomas read the statement and said it was the language of someone whose lawyers had told him to say as little as possible while appearing to say something substantial. Marcus said that sounded about right. Thomas said, it also means they are not planning to fight the review frontally, which means they are going to try to manage it quietly, which means our job is to make sure the documentation remains visible and complete so that quiet management is not possible. Marcus asked what that looked like practically. Thomas said it looked like continuing to be responsive to any requests from the ethics board investigators, continuing to maintain the complete record, and continuing to do his job with the same precision and integrity that had produced the Alderman Street report in the first place, because the most powerful argument for the legitimacy of his assessment was the ongoing evidence of the quality of his work. Marcus said he could do that. Thomas said he knew. The ethics board process moved forward through February in the way these processes moved, with occasional written requests for documentation and occasional updates from Thomas and the occasional Paul Whitmore piece adding another layer to the public record and the occasional email from someone Marcus did not know who had read the articles and wanted to say something. Marcus answered the documentation requests promptly and thoroughly. He maintained the record. He did his work with precision. He answered the emails. He called his mother on Sundays. He went to the gym on Saturdays with Deshawn, who never made anything weird. He met Caroline on Wednesday mornings at Thornwood when she was in the city, which was more often in February than it had been in December, her consulting schedule having shifted in ways that brought her through on a more regular basis, which Marcus was careful not to read too much into and equally careful not to ignore. They talked about everything. About structural engineering and trauma response and the specific challenges of consulting for institutions that needed help but were resistant to the implications of needing it. About the document Marcus was writing and what it was becoming and whether it had an audience and what that would mean if it did. About the ethics process and the Whitmore series and Denise Okafor, whose situation Thomas had reviewed and found actionable within a narrow but real window, and who had decided to file, which Thomas had described as one of the braver decisions he had seen in a year that had contained several. About Marcus Tyrrell from Savannah and the river he had wanted to study and the environmental science degree that had not happened and what it meant to carry someone that way and what it meant to put them down somewhere they could be found. They talked about all of it with the easy-ranging quality of two people who had discovered they were genuinely curious about each other's minds, not in the performing way of new connection but in the settled way of people who have already seen each other under pressure and know the kind of currency their attention carries. One Wednesday in mid-February Caroline brought something to the table that she had not mentioned before. She set it down beside her tea, a manila envelope, and said it had come to her from Paul Whitmore, who had received it from a source inside Cornerstone Development Group. Marcus looked at the envelope. He said, "What is it?" She said, "An internal memo. From 8 months ago. Addressed to the senior partners at Cornerstone from their government relations consultant." He asked what it said. She said, it identified Marcus's Alderman Street assessment as a potential obstacle to the permit timeline and recommended engaging their council contacts to explore options for addressing the obstacle. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "They planned it?" She said, "They planned it before Bryce Calloway ever walked into a coffee house. The coffee house was an opportunity. They had already decided that if an opportunity arose they would use it." He sat with that. 2 months of the situation had given him a fairly complete picture of what had happened and why, but this was different. This was the document underneath the document, the structural record of the forces that had been in motion before the visible event, the proof that what had looked like a reaction to a Tuesday morning was in fact the execution of a plan that predated it. He said, "Thomas needs to see this." She said, "Thomas is already looking at it. Paul forwarded a copy to him this morning before bringing it to me." He asked why Paul had brought it to her. She said, "Because Paul Whitmore is a careful journalist who understood that this piece of information was going to land differently depending on how it was delivered and to whom and in what order, and that the person it was going to land most differently on was Marcus, and that giving it to someone Marcus trusted to help him process it before it became part of the public record was the right way to handle it. Marcus looked at her. He said, "Paul Whitmore thought that through." She said, "Paul Whitmore has been doing this for 7 years. He thinks most things through." Marcus nodded. He looked at the envelope on the table between them. He looked at Caroline. He said, "They had already decided to use me before he walked in." She said, "Yes." He said, "It did not matter what he said or what I did or whether I reacted or stayed quiet. The moment my report created a problem for their timeline, I became a target." She said, "Yes. That is what the memo says." He said, "So it was never about the coffee house." She said, "The coffee house was a mechanism. The decision was about the money." He was quiet for a long time. Caroline did not fill the quiet. Outside, the February morning moved through its cold business, the street going on in its ordinary way, indifferent to the weight of what was being understood at a table inside a coffee shop on an unremarkable Wednesday. He said, 2 months. She said, "Yes." He said, "I spent 2 months fighting something that was decided in a room I was never in, by people I had never met, for reasons that had nothing to do with the Tuesday morning or the coffee house or anything that happened between me and Bryce Calloway. It was about the permits. It was always about the permits." She said, "Yes." He said, "And the coffee house just gave them the story they needed. A disabled veteran making trouble. Something they could attach to my name to give the administrative action a surface that was not about protecting a development company's permit timeline." She said, "Yes. That is exactly what it was." He picked up his coffee. He looked at the snow that had started outside, soft and steady, the February version of December's first real snow. He said, "Does it change anything?" She thought about that honestly, the way she always thought about things he asked her. She said, "It changes the picture. It does not change what you did or what it produced. The report stands. The referral stands. Denise Okafor's filing stands. The Whitmore series stands. The downstream effect stands. Everything that happened because you documented it honestly and pushed back when the machine pushed is real regardless of how far back the planning went." He said, "I know that." She said, "But it is still worth being angry about." He said, "I am not angry." She looked at him. He said, "I am something else. I am the thing that comes after anger when you have had enough time to look at it clearly." She said, "What is that called?" He said, "I do not know if it has a name. It is the feeling of understanding something completely, the complete structural picture, all the forces and where they came from and why they acted the way they did and what they were trying to protect. It is the feeling of having assessed the whole building from the foundation to the roof and found every hidden failure and written every one of them down. It is not anger. It is something colder and cleaner and more useful than anger." She looked at him for a moment with the expression that was quieter and more private than her professional face, the expression he had come to associate with the moments when she was not consulting or briefing or managing a situation but was simply present, simply herself, seeing something she valued in the person across from her. She said, "That is a very good description of a very important thing." He said, "I had a good teacher." She said, "You taught yourself." He said, "I had help knowing it was worth teaching." She picked up her tea. He picked up his coffee. They sat in the snow light of a February morning and held what they now knew about how it had all begun, held it the way you hold a structural finding, carefully and without flinching, because the truth of a building's condition was not improved by looking away from it and neither was anything else worth knowing. The snow kept falling through the rest of February and into the first days of March, turning the city into something quieter and more patient than it usually allowed itself to be. Marcus continued his work at the firm with the same steady precision he had always brought to it, moving through assessments and reports as though the past 3 months had been nothing more than a temporary interruption in the ordinary rhythm of his days. The truth, of course, was more complicated. The Alderman Street permits remained on hold. The Ethics Board review continued its deliberate pace. Councilman Calloway's office issued occasional statements that grew increasingly careful in their wording, each one attempting to frame the referral as a misunderstanding rather than a consequence. Paul Whitmore's series ran 2 more installments, each adding another documented connection between Cornerstone Development Group's financial interests and the decisions made in Calloway's committee. The downstream effect kept moving outward in ways Marcus could sometimes see and sometimes only sense. One Thursday afternoon in early March, Thomas Greer called with an update that carried a different weight than the previous ones. The Ethics Board had completed its preliminary review and had voted unanimously to open a full formal investigation into Councilman Raymond Calloway for violations of the city's ethics code, specifically regarding the improper use of official position to influence regulatory outcomes for the benefit of a campaign contributor. Thomas said the vote was not public yet, but it would be within 48 hours. He said this was the point where the process stopped being quiet. Marcus listened to the words and felt something settle inside him, not triumph exactly, but the clean, solid click of a structural element finally locking into place after months of careful alignment. He asked what happened next. Thomas said the board would now issue formal requests for documents and testimony. Cornerstone would be required to produce internal communications. Calloway would have to respond under oath. The timeline would stretch into the spring and possibly the summer, but the direction was now fixed. Marcus thanked him and hung up. He sat at his desk for a long moment, looking out over the loading dock where the forklift was making its familiar steady beep as it moved pallets in the cold afternoon light. He thought about the ivory envelope that had arrived on a Friday morning 3 months ago. He thought about the load-bearing wall on the 4th floor of the Alderman Street building that someone had tried to hide. He thought about how long hidden failures could remain hidden until someone with the right training and the right stubbornness decided to look in exactly the right places. He called Caroline that evening. She was between flights, sitting in an airport lounge with the particular background hum of travel around her. He told her about the Ethics Board's decision. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's the moment the shape changes for good." He agreed. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing and everything, the easy way they had fallen into over the past months, and when they hung up Marcus sat in the quiet of his apartment and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had been accomplished and what still remained. The formal investigation became public the following Monday. Paul Whitmore's article ran with the headline that made the referral impossible to ignore. Within hours, other local outlets picked it up. By evening, the story had moved beyond the city and was appearing in regional coverage. Marcus's phone began receiving messages from people he had never met, some offering support, some sharing their own experiences with similar patterns of influence, some simply saying they were glad someone had finally stood up. He read them all, replied where it felt right, and saved the rest in a separate folder he labeled simply Record. On a Wednesday in mid-March he met Caroline at Thornwood as usual. The snow had mostly melted, leaving the streets damp and reflective in the pale spring light. She arrived with 2 coffees already on the table and a small notebook open beside her tea. They talked about the investigation, about the downstream emails that kept arriving, about Denise Okafor's case which Thomas had taken on and which was now moving forward in its own careful way. Then Caroline closed her notebook and looked at him with the quiet, private expression he had come to recognize as the one she used when she was about to say something that mattered more than the ordinary conversation. She said, "I've been thinking about what happens after all of this is finished. Not the investigation or the permits or the ethics board. After the public part ends and the attention moves on to the next story." Marcus waited. She continued, "You're going to have a choice. You can go back to being exactly who you were before the Tuesday morning at Carver's, doing your assessments, living your routine, letting the whole thing become something that happened once. Or you can decide that the person who came out of this fight is the one you want to keep being. Not louder. Not dramatic. Just more deliberate about refusing to look away when the same pattern appears somewhere else. He thought about that for a long moment, looking out at the street where people were moving through the early spring cold with their collars turned up and their hands in their pockets. He said, "I've already started writing it down. The fall. The rehabilitation. The 2 years. The coffee house. All of it. I don't know what it is yet, but I know I'm not going to stop until it's finished." Caroline nodded once, the small economical nod that meant she understood exactly what he was saying and agreed with the weight of it. She said, "Then that's your answer. The writing is the choice. Every time you sit down at that table and put the truth on the page, you're deciding who you're going to be on the other side of this." They sat with that truth between them as the afternoon light shifted across the table. Outside, the city continued its ordinary March business, people going to meetings, running errands, living the small daily decisions that accumulated into lives. Inside Thornwood, two people who had met because one of them had refused to look away sat with their coffees and their quiet understanding that the real work was never finished, only continued in new forms, with new names, in new rooms. Marcus finished the document about the building on Decatur Street in the last week of March. He read it through one final time on a Sunday evening, sitting at his kitchen table with the map on the wall visible in his peripheral vision, the red dots marking every hidden failure he had found and named in 2 years of structural assessments. The document was longer than he had expected, honest in ways that sometimes made him uncomfortable, but he did not soften any of it. He saved it, closed the laptop, and sat in the quiet for a long time. He thought about the soldier named Marcus Tyrrell from Savannah. He thought about the river and the dog named General and the environmental science degree that never happened. He thought about Caroline carrying that story in a notebook until she was ready to set it down. He thought about his own story, now written and fixed and placed outside himself where it no longer pressed against everything else he was trying to carry. He stood up, made tea, and looked out the window at the city lights. Somewhere in the distance a siren moved through the night, the sound rising and falling in the particular rhythm of a city that never fully slept. Marcus Webb raised his cup slightly toward the window, not in celebration but in simple acknowledgement of the distance he had traveled and the distance still ahead. The spring arrived slowly, the way good things sometimes do after a long winter, with warmer light and longer days that made the city feel less like it was holding its breath. Marcus continued his work at the firm with the steady rhythm he had always known, moving through assessments and reports as though the events of the previous months had simply been one more structural challenge to document and file away. The Ethics Board investigation moved forward in its deliberate, unhurried way. Councilman Calloway's public statements grew fewer and more carefully worded. Cornerstone Development Group quietly withdrew its application for the Alderman Street permits pending the outcome of the review. Paul Whitmore's series concluded with a final piece that tied the documented pattern together without exaggeration, letting the facts speak in the plain language they deserved. Marcus finished reading the last installment at his kitchen table on a Thursday evening in late April. He closed the newspaper's website, looked at the map on his wall with its growing collection of red dots, and felt something settle into place that had been waiting for months to find its proper alignment. The fight was not over, but its shape had changed from something hidden and private into something visible and public. That change mattered more than any single verdict could. On the first warm Saturday in May, Marcus drove out to his mother's house with Caroline. It was the first time she had met his mother, and the introduction happened with the simple, unforced ease of people who did not need to perform anything for each other. His mother made lunch, asked Caroline practical questions about her work, and listened with the same quiet attention she had always given to things that mattered. Later, while Marcus and Caroline helped clear the table, his mother caught his eye across the kitchen and gave him the small nod that meant she approved, not with words but with the particular economy of understanding that had always defined her. In the car on the way back to the city, Caroline said, "Your mother is a good woman." Marcus smiled. She is. Caroline looked out the window at the passing streets. She raised someone who knows how to stand when it matters. He was quiet for a moment, then said, she also raised someone who knows when to sit down and write it all down. Caroline laughed softly, the real unguarded sound he had come to recognize as one of his favorite things. That too. The document he had been writing finally reached its natural end in the middle of May. Marcus read the completed version once, straight through, then saved it and closed the laptop without ceremony. He did not know yet what he would do with it, whether it would remain private or find its way into the world in some form. What he knew was that the story was now outside him, fixed and honest, no longer pressing against the rest of his life. That was enough. On a quiet Wednesday morning at the end of May, Marcus and Caroline sat at their usual table in Thornwood. The spring light came through the windows at a generous angle, warming the wood and making the ordinary coffee shop feel momentarily like somewhere important. Caroline had brought no notebook this time. She simply sat with her tea and looked at him with the quiet, private expression that had become familiar and dear. She said, I've been offered a longer-term contract here in the city. It would mean less travel, more stable work with the regional hospital system on their crisis protocols. Marcus looked at her. And she smiled, small and real. And I'm going to take it? He felt something warm and steady settle in his chest, not dramatic, not loud, simply right. Good, he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture natural and unhesitating. I'm not staying because of the contract, she said quietly. I'm staying because this feels like the place I want to be. With the work I want to do. With the person I want to do it beside. Marcus held her hand and said, then we'll do it together. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary late spring morning, people going to work, running errands, living the small daily decisions that accumulate into lives. Inside Thornwood, two people who had found each other because one of them had refused to look away sat together in the warm light and let the future take the shape it wanted to take, unforced and honest. Marcus Webb continued his structural assessments. He continued writing when the need came to him. He continued meeting Caroline on Wednesday mornings and on many other mornings after that. The Ethics Board investigation reached its conclusion in early summer. Councilman Calloway was found to have violated the city's ethics code. He resigned from his position 2 weeks later. Cornerstone Development Group withdrew from several pending projects in the city. The Alderman Street building remained standing, its hidden failures properly documented and scheduled for remediation. None of it felt like a dramatic ending. It felt like the natural outcome of honest work done carefully over time. The downstream effect continued in small, quiet ways. Denise Okafor's case moved forward. Other people who had read the articles reached out with their own stories. Some of them found the courage to act. Some of them simply felt less alone. Marcus answered the messages he could and trusted that the rest would find their own way. On a warm evening in July, Marcus and Caroline walked along the riverfront after dinner. The city lights reflected on the water, and the air carried the particular soft warmth of a summer night that had finally arrived. They walked without hurry, hands occasionally brushing, talking about ordinary things and important things in the same easy rhythm. At one point Caroline stopped and looked out over the water. Do you ever think about how one Tuesday morning changed so much? She asked. Marcus stood beside her. Every day, he said. But not in the way you might think. I don't think about what I lost or what I gained. I think about the fact that I got to see what happens when someone chooses not to look away. And I got to be part of that choice. She turned to him. And now? He smiled, the quiet, solid smile of a man who had assessed the structure of his own life and found it sound. Now we keep choosing. Every day. In the small ways and the large ones. We keep refusing to look away. Caroline nodded once, the small economical nod that meant she understood completely. She took his hand again and they continued walking along the river, two people who had learned the same difficult, honest lesson, that standing up, even when you are sitting down, even when someone else stands for you, always costs something. And that the only real question is whether what it costs is worth what it buys. In the end, it almost always is. The city moved around them, full of its ordinary stories, some ending, some beginning, some still in the long middle where most of the living happens. Marcus Webb and Caroline Reyes walked through it together, carrying what they had learned and what they had written down and what they had chosen to keep building, one careful, honest day at a time. Some people stand up when everyone else sits down. And sometimes, because they do, the rest of us remember that we can too.